Hey, folks. So today is going to be a heavy one, but I mean, have you come to expect anything else from me in this show? So today we're going to be diving into the topics of childhood trauma, narcissism, suicidal ideation, emotional vulnerability, empathy, setting boundaries, trusting intuition, and all of their impact on one's career and entrepreneurial journey. And we're going to be doing all that with our guest, Stephen Pemberton. Stephen is an accomplished e-commerce entrepreneur, world-class virtual event specialist, and podcast host. As CEO of Hollowco, he helps coaches, authors, and small business owners reach their ideal customers through automated virtual events. He's also the host of the Voice Like a Lion podcast, where he explores the intersection of Christian values and business. He's got a remarkable story of resilience and growth. I mean, the dude transformed his life from pretty much losing everything in 2015 to becoming a seven-figure business owner. But, I mean, the thing that really stood out to me when getting to know Stephen, well before we recorded this episode, was his Christian faith and how much it has guided his journey to the point of even shutting down one of his businesses because he felt that the Lord was speaking to him and telling him he needed to do so. And as a non-religious person, that sounds honestly pretty crazy to me. And when you hear things like that, to be frank, it typically comes from some, mega church pastor grifter type that, they have some sort of story that they're trying to sell you. But with Stephen, he and I got connected through a mutual friend, and we got to know each other, with no agenda, just as people. And his sincerity was very real. And I very much so came out of it being like he believes all that, and he's being truthful. And so I wanted to know what that voice is. Because clearly he, it's real to him. He's hearing something, and I trust his perception of reality. So I'm just like, as a non-religious person, I want to know, like, what does God sound like? How do you know, that's not just say like intuition. And these were all things that really like I wanted to have a better understanding of. And frankly, I don't think I've heard anybody else talk about that. And it kind of made me scratch my head and be like, what? Why isn't that more of a common topic? I feel like there's this huge divide between like people that are like not religious and very religious, and they don't talk very often, and when they do, it's very combative. It's very Richard Dawkins, whatever. So I wanted to kind of cut through the bullshit and just have a pretty real conversation as friends, and we touch all that later on in the conversation. But hearing his story and really how he got to that point, I feel like is really incredibly powerful, and it really colors a lot of what he says. It gives it a lot of context. So anyway, we're going to be diving into all that and much more. And I bring you the great, the powerful Stephen Pemberton. So you're meeting all these people. You're connecting with a lot of people. That's one of the three ways we got connected. I'm really kind of curious later on to get into what are your goals with that and from here. But I'm kind of curious. Like, I listened to some of the podcasts that you've been on. The thing that I didn't hear is like your story, like going way back, like before you even were an entrepreneur. So I'm really curious, like, what was your childhood like?
Man, my childhood was, and I'll just unload for everyone listening. Is
Go
when I
for it.
when I was a child, I was very much pushed to be a perfectionist, and which was very interesting because my mom and dad, they both grew up poor. They grew up in very difficult situations. And for my mom in Hawaii, it's kind of a cultural thing where if you end up with nothing, you just move in with more family. Like family takes care of family. Period. They're a unit. But she grew up very poor, and so did my father. My father grew up with my grandfather was wildly abusive to him, his four brothers, and to his mom. And it's a story that I can neither confirm nor deny because I was not there. But I heard it from one of the brothers that he was such an evil man that the KKK showed up at his house and burned a cross and told him, "Hey, if you keep doing this, we're going to come back for you." And
Jesus
that's
Christ.
wild because my grandfather is white.
Yeah.
So, or was. He is no longer with us. But with that being said, is that dictated how my parents viewed the world. One of the
Yeah.
things that my dad has looked back on and he talks about quite often is he had an opportunity to go to West Point. And he actually got a full scholarship to go to West Point, and he never knew about it until 10 years down the road when I think it was his dad or his mom told him, "Hey, you had a scholarship, you just didn't know about it." Imagine
Wow.
that. Like that could have changed his life.
Did
Now,
they just
granted, I
hide it
probably
from
wouldn't
him?
be here. Yeah, this kept it from him.
Why? They just want to keep him around, or?
No, because he at 17 he left and he went and joined the Air Force, so it didn't keep him around. I honestly just think that it was a manipulation tactic to just try to control his life
Yeah,
and to
yeah.
make him feel lesser than, because there was stories from some of my uncles that talked about how they weren't even allowed to sit down in the car. They had to stand in the back seat, like in the floorboards. They had to stand. They couldn't sit because the my grandfather didn't want the seats to get creased.
Jesus Christ.
My
So he
grandfather, yeah,
preferred the seats of his car over the
over his
lives
kids.
of his kids.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's bad when the KKK has a moral high ground here, but, like, in the ca like, it's pretty bad when they have to be the person to be like, "Hey, this might be this you might be going a little too far, but Jesus Christ, yeah, like, fucking ugh." So you, yeah, man, so how did that manifest with your parents, like, you with your dad? Like, how did what was the downstream effects of that? Like,
There's a
did
lot.
he did he basically, like, continue that kinda trend, or did he rebel against it?
No, he rebelled against it. I'm very
Okay.
thankful for my father. I'm thankful for my mom. My father, he said, "I'm not gonna be this dad," and I'm very thankful for that. He tried to love on me as much as he could, as much as he understood, because he didn't know what that meant. He'd never seen it, so he just tried to give me the most he could. What was very interesting is with my father, he and I were basically best friends from the age of whenever I was born until about 13, and then there was a switch flipped at 13 where I had to become a man. So he
Mm,
went from being my best friend to my worst enemy. And it was the exact opposite with my mom. From the time I was born until 13, my mom was my worst enemy. And then at 13, when my dad made the flip, my mom made the flip and she became my best friend. It was very odd. And especially as a younger child, growing up, my parents pushed me to make straight A's. They wanted me to be perfect in every sense of the word. And I was so introverted, I was almost a perfect child anyways. I loved being in my room. I loved being alone. I was very creative. That my parents always thought I was going to be an engineer, even though I hated math, so I'm not sure how that was going to play out. But the they pushed me to do everything perfectly. And if I didn't do something perfectly, they let me know it. And that grew this mindset in me from a very young age that if you're not going to be perfect, don't even try, because that's
yeah,
what I was told. And that's so far from reality, especially as an entrepreneur. You're not going to go from no business knowledge, no understanding, and you're not going to step into a new business and just immediately have the perfect game plan and everything's going to work perfectly. It's never going to be that way. It's
yeah,
not that way now. You can sit there and there's evidence all around. You look at Meta, you look at Google, you look at Amazon. They're laying off tens of thousands of people. So if anyone was going to be perfect in their business plan, don't you think that they would be one of them if they're some of the biggest companies in the world?
yeah,
And if they're not, then how can we be? But
for
that,
sure.
yeah, as a kid, that was so difficult. And especially one thing that was interesting is I felt from the age of 0 to 8 that my mom was never around. And I used to ask my dad, I used to say, why does mom not love us? Like, why is she never here? And he said, "Your mom doesn't love you. Like, your mom doesn't love
Jesus
us." He just
Christ.
straight up told me. And I was like, "All right." And it
Oh, thanks, dad.
yeah, thanks, dad. But it gave me this warped view of my mom. But what was really
Oh, fuck.
interesting was I went so old when I got older, I think I was 24. I was probably 24. And so 5 years ago or so, I went to my first ever conference. I went to a Tony Robbins conference. My mom had bought tickets for my wife and for her, but then when she came and visited us, she said, "Hey, I feel like I'm supposed to give this to you. You go, have this experience whenever whatever comes up. If it's something about me, when you come back, I want us to talk about it." And I said, "Okay, cool." I didn't want to go. I didn't really care for Tony Robbins, but when I went, it was a great experience. And I had this question that I just explained where I didn't feel like you loved me. I didn't feel like you wanted me from the age of 0 to 8. And as I got a little older, and so I came back and I just had the courage to ask her. We were sitting around the kitchen table and she said, "Okay, Steven, what came up in your mind while you were gone? And I would love to talk about it with you." And I said, "Well, I've had this question since I was a kid. I felt like you didn't want me from the age of 0 to 8. Like, you didn't want me, you didn't love me." And she said, "You're right." And I was just like, "Excuse me? What do
Yeah,
you mean I'm right?" Like, I would that's one of those questions when they say you can't handle the truth. That was one of those things I couldn't handle the truth. She said, "Oh, you're right. I didn't want you." She said, "I was still trying to discover myself and understand who I was and what I wanted to do. So I didn't want you. I just left you with your dad all the time." And that conversation still kind of messes me up. It's like, how can you give birth to something and then not want them. And granted, like my mom, she when she discovered who she is, she loves me now. I love her. We have a great relationship now. But it was especially after she said that, it took a long time for me to process that.
Yeah. Yeah. What so there's so much to unpack there. It seems like this like manipulation and control is definitely like something that came from what was your mother's parents like? Because you said your father's parents were very your grandfather very emotionally abusive and just
Physically abusive, yeah, all of it.
yeah, yeah. So what was your mother's parents like?
Yeah, it's just as bad on that side. Is with my mom, she I didn't know this. So the grandmother that I grew up with, she looks identical to my mom. So I thought, okay, that's my grandmother. But that's actually not my grandmother. That's actually my aunt. And I didn't know that until after she had passed
Huh.
away. And the my mom sat me down, she kind of explained it to me that her dad and her actual mom, they didn't want her, so they just gave her up and her aunt took her in. And that became who I know as my grandmother. And my mom, my actual grandmother, she died. And my mom blames her father for that. Now, I don't know fully what that means. My mom and dad are very secretive when it comes to their past. The conversations, the stories I just told you, most of those I know from other people who explain it to me, who were in the situation with them. But for them, they have kept it all very close to the chest. And if you look at it in poker terms,
Yeah.
but that I didn't even know I had a grandfather. I was actually in Hawaii with my mom, and we were at a luau, so an actual luau where we were hanging out with all of our family. And we had met her brother earlier that day, so we were coming home, coming back to where we were staying with our family. And I get out of the car and I see this taller, older gentleman standing by the door. And I went, "Huh, I haven't seen him before. I wonder who he is." Because for me, I'm 6'4", and at that time I think I was 6'2", and he was about my height. And I thought, "Oh, he's pretty tall." And my mom looked at me dead in the eyes and said, "Steven, this is your grandfather." And I was just floored because I thought I didn't have a grandfather. I didn't even know he existed. And she tells me this. I'm right here in front of this guy. He tries to say hi to me. I try to say hi to him. She grabs me and pulls me away. She she hated this man because of the thought process that he had somehow caused her actual mom's death. So that was huge. There was so many different abusive things that happened to my mom at a young age growing up that you would think that you would want to stay in a place like Hawaii, but because of everything she had experienced, she moved she moved all the way to Florida, basically, in the Air Force. That's actually where my parents met. And those so yeah, both sides of my parents' families were absolutely messed up. They
Yeah.
had a lot to play into who they were.
How did your parents meet? Like, it sounds like they're very, very emotionally distant and repressed, which I can understand. I mean, they had no role models of healthy, loving relationships, so they got together. What do you think? How did they meet? What do you think attracted them to each other?
That's a great question. But the way that they met, so we'll unpack that one in just a second.
Yeah.
But the way that they met, so my dad is 17. He lies on his application form to the Air Force, says he's 18, and he gets in. So he gets shipped off to Florida. Then my mom, she was telling me that she was sitting on a beach one day looking up at the stars and just saying there has to be more to life than this. And she went and put in her application for the Air Force. It gets approved, and that's when she goes and tells her whole family, "Hey, I'm leaving." And they tried to beg her and they tried to do everything possible to get her to stay, but she couldn't. Like, you can't. You are actually legally obligated to go into
They
the Air
own your
Force.
ass now.
Yeah, exactly. And so she gets shipped off to Georgia. Is that true? I'm not sure. She gets shipped off to basic training. We'll just say that. And at basic training, she gets her orders. So your orders is what you get, and that tells you where you're going to be stationed. And she's looking at the board at her orders, and her orders tell her Warner Robins, Georgia. And she says, "Georgia?" She said, "What's in Georgia besides rednecks?" And which is true. And so she said, "I don't want to go to Georgia." And this guy walks up behind her. She said, "I didn't, maybe he was there the whole time. Maybe he had just walked up." But he said, "Warner Robins, Georgia. Did I just hear you say Warner Robins, Georgia?" And she said, "Yeah, I don't want to go there. I don't want to be around those people." And he said, "I'm from Warner Robins, Georgia." He said, I would love to go there. He's like, they got me going to Florida. He said, do you want to switch? And she said, yeah, absolutely. And what's very interesting, because she didn't tell me this until recently, was if you're in the military, you can't just, like, let's say you and I are in the military and you're a lieutenant and I am a staff sergeant. We can't switch
Yeah.
orders because we're not the same rank. But
Yeah.
for her and this random dude in the hallway, they were the same rank. So they were able to to their go to the commanding officer, their CO, and say, "Hey, we have the same rank. We want to switch." And they switched them. And my mom goes off to Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, right outside of Destin. And that's where she runs into my dad. She says that one day she's hanging out in the basically the commissary, and she just hears this redneck accent asking her if she wants a beer. And he's sitting on the couch, and that turns out to be my dad. And I thought that's crazy because my dad, I never see him drink. I've never seen him drink. So I just found that very interesting. And I think what really drove her and brought them together, my mom is much more free spirited. She wants to be able to do anything and everything. And that's kind of bitter in the butt in certain areas, especially with business, because it's like, okay, Chat GBT is new. Let's try this thing out. And it's like, but you could do a million different things. Why this? And it just feels like she's tried a million different things, but I digress. But with my father is very stability driven. So once he gets locked in on one thing, it's one thing, period. And that's what drew her to him. Was at the time he was apparently he drank all the time. So he was much more loose. Now he's much more rigid, but he was really loose, but he was also very stable. She knew that she could depend on him. He was dependable. And she had never had that in her life. And with my dad had never really had that kind of freedom in his life. So if I was to happen to guess, that is what drew them together, was almost the opposites attracting.
Yeah. So they're together. They're down in Destin, which I mean, I'll probably take being on the coast of Destin over just some random place in Atlanta. No hate on Atlanta, but so it's not like that's probably a wise decision. But or not Atlanta, Georgia, but and I like
Mhm.
Atlanta, but anyway, yeah. So they're together and then they have you. Is it one of those situations where they was like abortion ever on the table, or like did they how did they decide to did was having you the thing that cemented them being together, or like how did that whole roll? Because like for example, for me, like my parents, my dad was like in the process of thinking about going to California, and then like they were probably not going to stay together, had me. My mom didn't want to have an abortion, so my dad stayed around because my grandfather was an orphan, like a literal orphan,
Mm,
and grew up in orphanages and stuff like that. Foster had a really bad time. I don't kind of similar to you. I pieced together snippets over the years, but I never really got the full story. Um, but from what I understand, like my grandfather had a really difficult time and he worked his way up to being kind of middle class from nothing. I mean, he literally is one of those like kind of came from nothing, kind of worked his way up. Um, and he just told my dad, like, you can't fucking do this. You can't do this. You can't just leave this kid. And so my dad stayed and but that caused a lot of conflict for a long time, a lot of like, you kind of grew up knowing like the only reason your parents are together is because of you.
mm,
So that perfectionism, that feeling like you can't, like you almost like you have to justify your existence because now
yep.
these two people are like here because of you, so you got to make the most of it. I mean, there's just so much there to unpack, but was that the case for your parents and you, or was it different?
It was A, thank you for sharing that. And then two is B, they know that to answer that shortly, I am not the reason why they stayed, because they didn't have me for 7 years after they got married. That's
Oh
a long
wow.
time.
Yeah.
But and what's interesting is because they both shunned their families, was they got married in the Air Force on a beach, and it was just them and the pastor. So they did it very small. It was just them. And then a few years into their orders, or their technically their deployment, was my dad had the opportunity to re-up, and I don't remember what it was. I don't remember why he did it. It was something along the lines of he just didn't want he wanted to have a family. This is what it was they were going to ship him off to Germany, and they were going to ship her to the Philippines, and they were married. And typically when you're married, you go together.
Yeah.
and they were going to separate them. And he said, I just got married. This is my wife. I am not about to lose my family to the military. So he left the military. He, he, again, the stability piece, which he went back and moved in with his parents. And even though he hated them, he moves back in with them. And then he gets my mom out of the military. They move in with his parents. And again, we already heard about my grandfather. My grandfather is the definition of a racist, was. And with that being said, my mom was just explaining to me how she walked through that time. And my dad, he ends up going and working at the post office. He gets on first, and then my mom gets on, and that was the thing that helped them become middle class. And then they were explaining living in a duplex that they had to fix everything. There was holes in the roof, there was rats, all the stuff. And then I think it was a few years later, they end up getting pregnant. And my mom is she works. She's a hard worker. So she's at the post office working. I think she's 6, 7 months pregnant. And she basically overdoes it and loses the child. And she has a miscarriage right there at the post office. And
Wow.
the one thing that really stumped me was she said that she knew in the moment that she had lost the baby, but she went back to work. It's like, you
Jesus.
didn't go home. Like, you didn't take a
Yeah.
moment to process what just happened. You just kept going. And that's what it's interesting, because when I talk about it, it makes me emotional, because that's what I grew up in. Was
Yeah.
there was more connection to stability and making sure that you were taken care of than even to a child, even to the emotions attached to the kid. And and when that happened, there was years where my mom said, "Okay, obviously this is what happened, so we're not even going to have a kid. We're not even going to try again." And she was cool with that, and my dad wasn't. My dad wanted to have a kid. And but my mom is a very dominant presence. She's a very dominant force. So her way, or the highway. And then my cousin came along, so that I had an older cousin, and then I had this second cousin that came along, and my mom said that she was holding Jessica's her name there. She was holding Jessica, and just immediately she wanted a kid. And so that was the thing that led her to wanting a kid. So they tried everything to have another kid, and it didn't seem like anything was working. And then all of a sudden, they ended up pregnant, and that ended up being me. And it was just another one of those things of trying again. Like, they just tried again. But that's how I came along, and I found that whole story to be very interesting, just for the facet of my mom. Even after I was born, she wanted me but didn't. And
Yeah.
I find that very interesting, that you had this miscarriage, there was no emotional attachment. When then all of a sudden you hold this other baby and you say, I want this, you have one, and then there's no emotional attachment.
Yeah.
And that really, I think that's part of the reason that pushed me into seclusion, that pushed me away from people, was twofold. One, my own mom didn't have that emotional connection with me at that time. So I didn't know a mother's love. And then my father loved me and he cared for me. My father was so consumed with me as a child that he almost drove himself crazy before I was born, because
Huh.
he got to the point where he could not function, and my mom had to do everything around the house and take care of him, because he almost became a broken man, afraid that they were going to lose me too. He was sitting there on the day of my birth and saying, 10 fingers 10 toes, 10 fingers 10 toes, 10 fingers 10 toes, until I was born. And he just wanted me to be good. And he apparently lost tons of weight, apparently lost like 60 pounds. On As my mom was gaining weight, he was losing weight. And then when I came along, as I grew up, my mom didn't have that emotional attachment. My dad had this over attachment to a certain degree, but it was odd, because he had this attachment to me to the point where I could almost do anything I wanted. And then my mom was very strict. So they're both in the military. So it was still very strict. It was just this weird dichotomy of
Yeah.
different emotions and mindsets. And that's what and then I just really, I felt most comfortable being alone. It
Yeah.
got to the point where, especially as I got a little older, where I would just tell my parents, "Hey, I'm just going to be in my room," and I would just be in my room alone for pretty much the entire day. I wouldn't go outside. I didn't have really any friends. I just loved being alone, because that was the one place I guess I felt safe when I look at it
Yeah.
back then, because there was not. There was not a mother's love to sit there and draw me out. My father, he was so stability driven and not really emotional, that even though he had this over attachment to me, he also, anytime we'd play games together, he would make sure to basically exploit the game in such a way where I just got destroyed. If he would do anything and everything possible to basically crush me and to make me feel lesser than in every single game. And so the best, safest place I could find was being alone.
God, there's it's such an interesting dichotomy that you're saying. Like, what's interesting to me is like your mom overcorrected and had this survival instinct that like was her North Star. Like everything when you're talking, like everything about her seems to scream like survival at all cost. And what's really interesting is, to me that's like when she had that miscarriage, it's almost like she didn't attribute that to her. Like, it
Yeah.
was just this accessory thing, and that's one of the things that stood out to me is, like, most people, when you have a kid, you now see that as an extension of yourself and actually the thing that you put above yourself. So the survival of your kid, I mean, from an evolutionary perspective, like that's literally like your goal is to c- help see the next generation and make sure it survives before you die. So like that's the whole point, if there is a point to life. But with your mom, it's almost just like that switch never really fully got flipped, and it seems to me it's almost like she wanted a kid almost as like an accessory or as like a pet almost. Like,
Hmm.
it's not that she didn't care for you, but it's almost just like her survival seemed to trump yours. At least that's what I'm getting from what you're saying, early on. Your dad, it's almost just like your dad put everything into you, like the hopes and whatever, and it's almost like he was trying to make up for like the meaninglessness of his life, and he gave you, your life gave him purpose.
Yep.
So he put everything into it. But your mom was kind of the opposite. It was just like her life, her purpose seemed to be herself. And
Oh yeah.
and so there's that weird thing. But then the thing that stands out to me also is like there's that ego. Like you said, like there was a flippening at some point where your dad put like everything into you, but then there was a certain point where he still had to like best you and, like, almost like you were competition in a way, which is, like, really strange that your dad was kinda, like, love bombing you at times, but then being, like, a complete asshole the rest of the time. Or it's just, like, that's gotta be weird. I mean, it almost like it's like, at least in a way, your mom was consistent,
Hmm. Yeah.
like, in that detachment. So, I mean, I get it. Like, that emotional seclusion, it's like there was so much baggage and expectations. You just like, "I just want a moment to fucking breathe, dude," you know? So what was that? It seems to me like there was that perfectionism that grew out of that expectation that your parents seem to have on you. Um, but neither your parents like had any real coping mechanisms.
Mm-mm.
So
Not
I'm
that I
assuming
knew of.
not that you knew. Okay, so I'm curious if that points itself. That what do you mean by that? Like, was there coping mechanisms that they had that were just kind of lingering beneath the floorboards that you found out later?
And that's what. Well, I'll talk about it in a. I'll unpack that in just a second. I want to
Okay,
kind of rewind for a second on something that you were talking about, which is my father wanted to basically live vicariously through me.
yeah.
He wanted to have a father he never had. He wanted to be able to see me grow up and have fun and do different things. But at the same time, anytime he would do his best to make me upset. And
Huh.
it was wild, especially when it came to playing games together. If we were just hanging out watching TV, or we were, one of the fondest memories I have is we would go relic hunting. So I grew up in Tennessee, so there's a lot of Civil War battlefields and different things. So we would go out and go relic hunting, and I loved it. We'd just walk around the woods, find absolutely nothing all day, and then we go home. But I just love that time. There was just something about it.
Yeah.
And during those experiences, it was amazing. But anytime we played games, whether that be computer games and together or board games, he would do everything possible to make me mad. And not just upset, like screaming, crying, throwing stuff mad. And he would just get a kick out of it. And this is something that I had to bring up to my mom because he was doing it to my son. And I had to bring it up to her and I said, "Hey, this is a generational thing where it's not just me. I watched my dad get explosive angry where he was willing to fight people. He would run them off the road and try to fight them. And I remember this as a kid. And I said then he instilled that in me by getting so wildly enraged that I would sit there and try to run my fist through a metal door. And then now he's trying to do that to my son too. And I said I'm trying to stop this. I don't want that to get passed down to my son. And that was one of the aspects. But then when we sit there and we look at my mom with that detachment, yeah, for her, she was pretty much consistent. She was pretty much consistently detached. And that consistent detachment was what made it very difficult to get the attachment. It actually, I won't even say it was difficult because once the switch got flipped, where my dad made that switch, and then my mom made that switch as well, it became easier for me to make that connection with her because I just lost the greatest connection I had because my dad had been my best friend since I was born, and then for him to flip that switch, and then there was never a conversation that was good after 13. After my birthday, it was never a good conversation. He would always be alone. We never spent time together. We never played games together. The only time he would talk to me is if he was reprimanding me. And his theology was that he was going to make me a man.
Mm.
But then you have to ask my dad is one of the smartest people I know. But my question is that being radically smart, why not ask the question, what does a man actually look like? Because if
Yeah.
it's a man only based on the definition that you have, then that means that you would have had to parent me the way that you were parented to get the same result. So if you want the result to be you, you have to parent the same exact way. And if you have qualms with how you were raised, then why would you expect to get the same result? And
Yeah.
that was one of the things where I watched him almost become he was never physically abusive, but he was very emotionally abusive after that moment. And I watched him become very similar as far as emotionally to how he talked about his father being. And that was really hard to go through every because of basketball. I love sports. I grew up playing sports. I actually hated sports as a kid. My mom forced me to play sports, and I thankfully I was naturally athletic, and I ended up playing every sport, loving basketball. So I just went all in on basketball. And if I wasn't the best on the court that day, my dad made sure to let me know. It would be a
Mm.
30-minute drive back home, and he would just rip me apart about me wasting his time, about it being a waste of time that I've done all this stuff that I didn't care all of these negative connotations around me just playing something I loved. I didn't expect to be Michael Jordan, but I just wanted to be the best I could be. And I just wanted to have fun because I didn't have fun anywhere else. For me, I withdrew into video games. Video games became my escape, became my coping mechanism along with pornography. Pornography was also one of those big coping mechanisms. So going full circle into the question that you asked was interesting because my father and my mom, I never once like found alcohol in the house. I never saw it. They never drank in front of me. So I never wanted to drink. I never had any affiliation with it. But it always because everyone has something. Everyone has some kind of coping mechanism, whether that be really good, there can be really good coping mechanisms or really bad. With my father, and this is a question that my mom has asked me in the past, is with my father, he he would work out a lot. So maybe that was a coping mechanism. But what I really think his coping mechanism was and what got past to me was pornography. And that's one that if you know how to do it, he's very tech savvy. You can hide it. Nobody will ever know unless you tell them. And that was one of those things because he used to say that he used to watch B movies all the time. And he used to say, well, I just like it for background noise. But I remember being a kid and looking at these B movies and there just be titties hanging out. And it's like being a kid and seeing that and it just intriguing me at a young age and being exposed to different things from the age of 7 that made me question why do I feel this way? Because and there's times I'm very intellectual as well. That's what led me into pornography was why do I feel this way? Why do they look different to me? So then just investigating that led me to a place where I'm trying to figure out everything about my body at a young age. I'm trying to
Yeah.
figure out everything about the female anatomy at a young age. And seeing that because I didn't think anything was wrong with it if my dad's watching it on TV. If my dad's got it pulled up, it must be fine. And so for me is I just don't think you're going to sit there and be alone in this basement watching B movies with titties and rape scenes and think that there's not ever going to be a moment where you just get overly excitable and you want to sit there and watch pornography or something to cope with the stress and the trials of life. So that was one that I think it's never come out. There's never been confirmation, but I feel it off of him that that was something that he's either dealt with or still deals with. One big one that he used to deal with was tobacco. He used to dip a lot. And I remember being young, I was probably 8 or 9, maybe even a little younger. And we get into this really old pickup truck that he had. And he gets this dip can out. And he gets this huge wad and just puts it in his bottom lip. And he looks at me. And I, the smell of it was disgusting. And he puts it in his lip and he looks at me and he says, "Steven, never start dipping because it will kill you." And this is while he has a dip in his mouth. And I said,
Yeah.
"Okay." I said, "Then Dad, why do you do it?" And I just asked him a question. But thankfully, because he had that over attachment to me, he took it, spit it out, and then he never did it again to my knowledge. And to my knowledge, he went cold turkey from that moment. And to my mom's knowledge too. But what I feel in my heart is it was a progressive thing where because there'd be times where I'd just be walking through the garage and I'd smell it. And I knew that smell. And the thing was smelling that and knowing that smell, I knew it had to be present. So this would be a year later, 2 years later, and I would never ask my dad because I was afraid of him. But the fact that I don't smell it anymore and I know that he had to quit at some point, that makes me very proud of him that he did that. Because I know with my own struggles with pornography, once I had this revelation and I shared it with my wife and we walked it out together, there's still been moments that that thing has tried to creep back up on me, and I've had those intentions of going and watching porn again, because maybe the stresses of life got so heavy that I needed a coping mechanism. So I
Yeah.
know that my dad had to walk through the same thing. There was a season that he had to walk through because he said he had been dipping from 8 years old. Like that's just what
Wow.
they did because he grew up on a farm and farming is very difficult. So the way that they told him to cope with it was to dip. And so that's something that if you walked into it at 8, you're telling me not to do it. He had to have been at least 38, 40. That's 40 plus years of your life.
Yeah.
I know it's going to, if it took you this long to get to a point to wanting to walk out of it, it's going to take you a while to walk fully out of it.
Yeah. And one does not just quit an addiction like that cold turkey. Particularly like just willy nilly, like, oh, okay, yeah, this is a bad influence on my son. Like that's the kind of thing where it's like, yeah, you might not do it in front of you, but I have a hard time imagining he just stopped.
Yeah.
Like, um, I'm curious. Do you think your dad considered himself a success? And what I mean by that is like this feeling of like him being combative and like feeling like he has to kind of like one up you in this way and like uh feeling like he has to like make you a man and all this other stuff, but it's just like his idea of what a man is, to your point, is like really skewed. And it sounds like he never really asked himself like, who should I be as a father? What does success look like? Because clearly dad had a very skewed idea of that. And it's clear to me he didn't want to do that, to you in the same way. So yeah, it wasn't as overtly abusive, but there's a lot of implicit like abuse there that might not just be as overt. But do you think that your dad considered himself a success? Like in the essence of this is the kind like I am the kind of person I want my son to grow up and be.
The short answer would be no. And the reason why I can say that with pretty genuine understanding is he's told me that right before we moved to where we're at now in Oklahoma is he talked about how proud of me he was, which was a breakthrough because had growing up he never told me he was proud of me, he never told me he loved me, which
Yeah.
is again odd because he was overly attached, but he never hugged me, he never told me he loved me. It was never I'm proud of you. Those things never came out of his mouth until in my older years. And to hear him say that to me and just to say that I'm an example of how a father should be to their son lets me know that, and he just apologized that he wasn't a good example to me because growing up, as I stated earlier, they wanted me to be an engineer. They wanted me to have a white collar corporate job. And that was their definition of success. So my definition of success was making $100,000 a year. That was it. And that's a lot of people's definition of success is getting to six figures. And it just never, I didn't like school. I hated school. I did well in school, but it just seemed completely meaningless, especially especially for someone like me who looks for efficiencies. I remember I did this economics class in high school, and we had this project. It was like a year-end project, and it was a big part of our grade. And you had to draw. It was wild how this happened. We had like three different jars, and you had to draw out of this jar if you had a family, if you were single. You had to draw out of this jar how much money you made per year. You had to draw out of this jar, I think, how many kids you have. And so I drew out of this jar. It was me, and I was single, but I had two kids. So I don't know what happened. I guess I was really bad at relationships or at 18. But I had a job that was making, I think, 50,000 a year. So I went and I did tons of research, and I said, this is the house I can get. Like, because I could sit there and look at my credit score that was apparently attached to my fictitious self. And so I had a house, I had a brand new Camaro. We shopped at Goodwill, and my kids rode the bus. That seems feasible to me. That's how most people live. They sit there and they take all their money, they buy nice stuff for them, and then they take their kids and they shop at Goodwill. And they have their kids ride the bus to school because I worked in the morning fictitiously. And so I take it, I build this whole thing. I have full blown spreadsheets about what this looks like. I take it to my teacher. I get like a 70. And she says, "This is not realistic." And I said, and I was about to say, "That's how you're living. I see it. Most of the people I see live this way. So how is it not realistic?" And especially because I had a full budget. This is how much the house costs. This is how much the Camaro costs. This is how much the home insurance costs. How much the car insurance costs. This is how much money we're spending on clothes. This is how much money I'm giving them for food. This is all the different things. This is it. That my kids play sports after school. This is when I meet them. This is when I pick them up. I said, how is it not realistic? I literally gave you a full explanation, and I have savings. It's not like I'm maxed out every month. It's like, and I'm saving money. This actually seems completely realistic. But that when she gave me a 70 on something that I knew was realistic, especially considering that most Americans have less than $1,000 in their savings account, lets me know that pretty much everyone lives stretched. So how would I not be realistic? When I saw that, I said, okay, school sucks. School's not for me. If I can literally give a realistic viewpoint on how most people live and they tell me it's not realistic. And for me, for anyone listening, that you can have your absolute own opinion. This is just my opinion when it comes to school. But school build is a system. It's a machine to build workers. It's not a machine to build entrepreneurs. It's not.
Yeah, I mean, that's how it started, yeah.
And exactly,
They
it
wanted you to
builds
be
workers.
competent enough to be a worker and, that's about it.
Yeah,
So,
just sit down, follow rules, do as you say. Like, do as you're told to do. To even as you transition from class to class, you have this much time. You have this much time for lunch. What does that look like? That looks like every single day the systems that most people go into to work. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with the job. I had a corporate job for 5.5 years. But what I am saying is school is not a good model for how to take care of your finances. School is not a good model of how to actually go out and do anything palpable in the world besides work. At least when my parents grew up, they had like they had home ec class where they teach you how to fix. My dad said they had one where they taught him how to fix cars. My mom had one where they teach you how to cook. They teach you how to take care of a house. They teach you how to balance a checkbook. At least back then, they taught you real skill sets that you could use in the world. It was almost like a trade school.
yeah.
Nowadays, you don't get none of that.
Yeah. So it's interesting. What one thing that kind of with that school project that stems to mind is you have a house, you're driving a Camaro, yet your kids are taking a bus, and which is nothing wrong with taking a bus, but taking a bus and they're shopping at Goodwill. Again, you and your needs are being prioritized, but your kids aren't.
Yep.
And that tracks completely with your mom's perspective of like the kids are almost like an accessory or they're secondary to like your needs. Um, did that looking back, did that surprise you at all?
No,
Yeah.
because there was two prong. My mom, right, with her detachment, but also my dad taught me that pretty much everyone had it out for me.
Huh.
He taught me to live with a chip on my shoulder, that people sucked, that that rich people sucked, but he also taught me that all people sucked. And so as I went through high school, I didn't have like I had some friends that were I would consider a best friend, but overall, I never really had community. And I always thought that people had my worst interests at heart. So for me, doing that school project is like, why would I care? Maybe I didn't even want these kids. And apparently, especially looking through the lens of my own life, if I'm a single dad with two kids, where'd the girl go? Where'd my wife go? Well, where were we just boyfriend, girlfriend? Where did she go? Why am I left with two kids? And when I sit there and I think of that, it just built legs under the table in my belief system that people don't have my best interests at heart, or she would have been there. She would have been there to help me take care of these kids. And because that she's not there, it's like I'm gonna take care of me. I'm 18 at the time, so it's like I'm an 18-year-old kid making 50 grand a year. I have two kids, and so I don't know when I was having these kids. Like I had to have been 16, but and on top of that, it's like she's not there. I have these kids, 50 grand a year. I know I can afford this house. I want to have things I want because I can't depend on anyone else to get me what I want. I can't depend on, and the thing, and I sit there, as you said, is like, I looked at those kids as they're supplemental to my life. They're not instrumental. And so they got, like, we've shopped at Goodwill. You basically got whatever you got. You didn't get the nicest of the nice because I was spending on me. And I think that's very interesting. Now we're getting into this existential look at parenting. That's why a lot of parents make the decisions that they make, is because they are the ones making the money. They never had in as a child, so they're going to take care of them before they ever take care of theirs. And I think that, yeah. So looking back, especially, I can definitely see why my viewpoint was that way, writing that and making this whole presentation, because of the parents that I have, where one was telling me that everyone had it out for you, and then my mom not being attached, it made it very easy for me to do the same thing.
Did your teacher ever tell you, elaborate why she thought it was unrealistic?
No, she just told
Do
me
you
it's
have
unrealistic.
what did you think it was then versus now, if it's changed at all?
I think the reason why she thought it was unrealistic was because I took care of myself and I didn't take care of the kids. But
Yeah.
I did. I did the bare minimum. I made sure they were fed. I made sure they had clothes. They went to school. I made sure to pick them up. I had I had a full understanding of how I was taking care of them. And I think for her, she had a hard time grasping that as an 18-year-old kid, which really, if you're a good teacher, you would ask the question, why did you pick you over them?
Yeah.
Ask a deeper question, because even now looking back, because my teacher was older than I am at this moment, so she had to have life experience. What life experience led you to make these decisions? Because that gives you a deeper insight onto not only the economics, but actually them. Because the way that you are is going to impact how you treat your money. And I think that it really bothered her that I chose a Camaro over a minivan. Why didn't
Yeah.
I choose more family oriented things? Why did I choose me over that? And I think that that was what made it unrealistic. But there's so many parents who parent that way that I'm not sure where she got unrealistic from.
Did she have children? Do you know?
She didn't. She didn't have children, and I think that that was part of the thing. Now there was a lot going on with that with that whole situation, because again, there was times that she would be spending a little too much time with the seniors, especially the senior men, and she was like 35 ish, maybe a little older, so that was odd. But I truly believe that because of the limited viewpoint that she had on herself and her life, limited the viewpoint she could have with her students, because each student is different. No one should have this exact formula that should equivalate to 100, especially when you're giving them wild amount of variables. How many kids, like, do you have a family? Yes or no? How much do you make in a year? Or how many kids do you have? You're giving variables and you're telling them to build an entire life, which then equivalates to a bazillion different variables. How could there be any one formula that equals a perfect score? Each
Yeah.
person is going to have a different representation. I think there was somebody in the class that they're making $100,000 a year and their house was $100,000, and they had a family and kids, and they had one car between them and their husband. That way they could make sure the finances were really good, and the kids had the all the name brands, and they drove their kids to school and picked them up, and they got a better score than me, because that seems more realistic. But that also, from a if you actually look at that, is why do you have such a deep need for stability that you're not even willing to take care of yourself at all? Like, you have shanked yourself to take care of these kids and you've put them above you. to the facet that they're in private school. You're taking them, their private school costs more than your house. What, how does that make sense for the entirety
That
of their schooling?
so that was your perspective at that time.
Yeah.
So you attributed self-interest with stability.
Yep.
W- When did that start to change? Because what I find interesting is like you're an outsider. Like you're an outsider not only in your family, like you're basically trying to seclude yourself from all this emotional baggage, but you don't appreciate your parents' perspective and the expectations that they're putting on you, yet you find yourself slowly adopting those same views that they do. Were you first of all, were you aware that you slowly started taking on like those perspectives that perhaps from the outside you probably wouldn't have appreciated or liked?
No. And I
Mm,
think that this is where, especially as I'm older looking back, is we hear you're the sum of the 5 people you spend the most time with. Well, who did I
yeah,
spend the most time with? I spent the most time with these 2 people. So obviously I'm gonna, and from a very young age, I wanted to be like my dad. My dad was my superhero. He loved me, took care of me. At least even though he didn't say it, I knew that he loved me. So for him, since I wanted to be so much like him, once he told me, "Hey, people have it out for you. They don't care about you. If they're rich, they're greedy." I adopted all of that because I wanted to be like him. And then on top of that, with the detachment of my mom at those really pivotal years of 0 to 8, those are the most pivotal years for a kid. That detachment right there, it actually it really stemmed, it branched into multiple different facets. It, even if you couple it with the pornography, because my mom was so detached from me, it detached me from women. I I just looked at girls and women as an ends to a mean. I did not look at them as people. In the facet of like they have their own needs, they have their own emotional stuff. They are going through life the same way I'm going through it. They just have different body parts. I didn't view them that way. And I believe looking back that part of that is because of the detachment that I had from my own physical mom. And then the over attachment I had to my father and being this very rigid person. And I didn't realize, and it really, even this conversation is opening up different avenues looking back into, oh shoot, maybe there's still things right now that I do that is part of that that I don't even realize.
yeah,
And that's actually been that kind of eye opening as we've talked about it, is when I parent my son, I find my, especially in the past, not so much now, and I still do struggle with it from time to time, is I find myself parenting the way that I was parented, where I will
yeah,
come down harder on my son for just being a kid, for just having fun, and because I want him to be more in line with how I am. I'm much more open to having fun now. I'm much more spontaneous, but I'm still very much like I have my limits on either side. And there's some people that they like their limits is having no limits. And I'm not the same way. Like my son is good with no limits. My son somehow, there's a so just simple math. If you put a shirt on, you have a 50% chance of putting it on the right way or the wrong way. But for the longest time, he would always 100% of the time put his shirt on backwards. So it used to bother me that he would do that. And it would actually make me physically upset that he would, because I would just think it's simple math. There's no way that you could do this every single time. Like if I just threw pants at you, it would magically, at least one out of every 2 times, it should go on straight. But how do I give it to you the right way and then it's somehow backwards? But that, looking back or looking at it and then looking at myself backwards, is I'm trying to parent him the way I was parented, where it was growing up, my dad made me be so perfect and in line with how he is and driving that stability. And then my mom doing the same thing, that I wanted to be almost all consuming with my son and making sure that he's perfect, like pushing him to be something he's not. And that's where, because my son's 9, he just turned 9 a couple weeks ago, is it was years, and there's still moments that I do that, but it was years that I treated him that way. And in the midst of trying to figure out myself and all the coping mechanisms, I was not the father I was supposed to be. When I quit my job and then I came into being a full-time entrepreneur, that's when I've actually been able to do that heart work to figure out things like this, find where these attachments are, be able to break them, because I don't want to pass down the same thing to my son. I want him to have different opportunities than I had. And the only way I can do that is to A, model it, because what I say to him means nothing if I don't live differently. And then two is to actually allow him to be different. He's not me. Maybe there's instances where he is very intellectual and there's moments that he wants to be very rigid, but there's also definitely moments where he's got his shirt on backwards and he runs around with one sock on. And those are just things I don't do. I make sure that I'm very in line with who I want to be. And so for him, it's just let him figure it out. I don't have to make him anything. And I think that's one of the hardest things, especially when you feel that you've achieved some level of success, at least in your eyes, and comparatively to your family, is you want him to be more successful. So the only way he could be more successful is if he does exactly what I did, but then some. But that's not the truth. If I want him to be different and to be a better version of me, a better version of him, the best version of him, I have to let him be him. He can't be me.
Yeah.
And I can't make him be me, or that's just going to destroy him. Because I've seen what that's done with my own parents trying to make me be them. It Anytime I made a decision that was out of line with the decision they would have made, they came down so hard. At one point in time, I was supposed to be a firefighter, and I went to EMT school and I went through the entire year, did all these clinicals, and for me, I watched people die. So I'm 18 years old and I'm sitting here doing CPR. I'm feeling people's bones break underneath my hands, and then they die. And then I see two kids that are so burned up that that one was, I think, 9 and the other one was 7, and the mom couldn't tell them apart. That's a big age gap for you to not be able to tell your kids apart. And that so seeing that at 18, it made me realize I do not want to be a firefighter. So I just had to tell my parents I'm not doing it. I'm not going to be a fireman, and they resented me for it for a long time. And that's what drove me to the space where they helped me get on at the post office. I quit the post office. I get into business with my wife, and I had no skill sets. We end up losing everything and living in a basement. Then once I got that warehouse job, that to everyone else I call it my corporate job, but my I get in this warehouse job and I hated it for the first 90 days. I'm working 16 plus hours a day, 5, 6 days a week. It's to the point where there's one day we work 21 hours straight. It's I'm having to sleep every single Saturday, the whole Saturday, because I'm only sleeping 3 to 4 hours a day. And I got to a point where I knew I wasn't going to quit, and I was one of the best. And I said, I'm about to show them that I don't need them. I'm about to show them that I don't need the connections. I don't need the schooling. That's what I've been told my whole life, that you need to have those things to be able to get a good job. And I just said in my head, I was like, I'm going to show them. And that led me to some really bad financial decisions because I ended
Yeah.
up buying a truck that was more expensive than the house we were living in. I did all these things to basically peacock and show that I was greater than I really was. And that that was just not good, because it was not good on many levels, especially because you're not really impressing anybody when you try to impress people. This actually makes you look bad. And it's like, dude, we see where you live. Like, we know where you live, and it's a complete crap hole. But yet you got one of the newest trucks and you spent 15 grand on extras. That doesn't make sense. But my whole point of doing it was to just rub it in their face that you didn't do this for me. Nobody did this for me. I did this for me. And that was such a toxic view, because especially when you get into business, you're going to go further faster, you have to align with people. You have to align with other business owners, you have to get a business coach, whatever it is. But if you always just think I'm going to be a solopreneur, only me, like only I can figure it out, and I'm going to show everyone around me that I can do this by myself, you're going to be very limited in the scope of who you can actually reach and where you can actually go. And I didn't know that at the time. And not until we went bankrupt did I really sit there and go, okay, maybe there's a better way than just trying to impress everyone around me. Maybe there's something else. But all of that just stems from my childhood. A lot of the decisions I've made in the past stem from my childhood. And that's one of those adventures, even on this podcast, where it's working through what part of me is me, what thoughts are mine, and what thoughts are
Yeah.
my dad's.
For sure. And that's a hard thing, is like you're having to reverse engineer your, not only, all these aspects of yourself, your coping mechanisms, who are you? I mean, I've been having to deal with that not only with, my parents and my upbringing, um, my journey as an entrepreneur, but really for me specifically, the biggest thing aside from just, my parents has been my mental health issues. So, I have ADHD, and I'm bipolar type 2, and I only discovered that I had ADHD when I was 23, and I only discovered I'm bipolar 2 years ago, man.
Wow.
So, that colors now you're looking back and you're just, like, reframing the whole all your decisions, your all those, like, rabbit holes and paths that you went down, and that kinda, uh really nasty self-critical voice, and that's and I have to imagine you got that too, being a perfectionist, just like you could do more, you could have done better, you could
Yep.
do, and it's like I simultaneously love myself. I don't think I'm one of those people that hates myself. I actually feel very highly of myself, but it's the fact that I know I could do better.
Mhm.
I'm brutal on myself. Tim Ferriss often says that, like, he would if he had a friend that treated him the way he treats himself, he would never want to have that person in his life. And that's me. I've been, recovering in that and trying to be kinder to myself. And I have to give a lot of credit to my best friend Kirby and my fiance Ava. It's like that they've been pushing me towards that. But part of it is just looking back and kind of doing a retrospective kind of, analysis of where all your decisions that you've made over the course of your life, where that came from. And all these coping mechanisms that you have that maybe you blame yourself. For you it's the porn addiction and all these other things where, like, you blame yourself for it, but really the more you peel back, you're like, oh, okay, there's a reason how I got this. This isn't my fault. A thing that's, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but something that's really helped me is adult children of emotionally immature parents, and it's kind of adjacent to adult children of alcoholics. And they used to just say alcoholics, but now they say emotionally immature parents because there's, that the overlap, the Venn diagram of alcoholism and emotional immaturity is with parents is pretty heavy.
Yep.
And for me, I've got, and I've been really diving into that, and it's made me be a lot more empathetic to my family,
Mhm.
and it's made me be a lot more empathetic to myself, and being able to kind of trace back, the generational trauma, if you will, and I would say the generational lack of good role models. You know, I think if anywhere, I only can go back as far as my grandfather, my grandparents. I don't know anything about their grandparents.
Same.
I don't know any of that. So, and even then, I don't know a lot. Um, so I'm tracing it back and I'm just like, oh, none of these people had any role models. I mean, frankly, Ava and I were talking about this recently where my partner and I was just like, we both really, when we met, didn't have many people at all in our lives, period, that were like, okay, that's a long term successful marriage. I mean, I knew some people in the business community loosely. I knew some people, but, like, I don't really know the ins and outs of their marriages. They seem on the surface like they've been together and they're happy, but as far as, like, people in our lives that we deeply know, we don't have any role models. And most of my friends, I've asked that question, like, did you growing up or now really have any positive role models of people that have been in relationships for decades and are happy? And they're all like, no. like we're just like, we're winging this, man. We're winging it. And it's just like the only real benefit that I think that we have, our generation, is that we're more likely to talk about this kind of stuff, A, and B, we've got, books and podcasts and all this other stuff where, we could talk for experts, but that's still not the same as, like, having people in your life that, as positive role models. And so I'm kind of curious, like, both of your parents to me sound like narcissists. Um, and it sounds like when you were younger, like, first of all, would you agree with that? Do you think that your parents, like, grew up, would you
Yeah.
clarify that? Yeah. It sounds to me like you growing up, you had flavors of that,
Oh,
and,
yeah.
like, you coulda went down that direction.
What I think is very interesting when I think of, even as you were saying, for me, my model of a marriage, which almost destroyed my own marriage, was a father. Like my mom and dad, they don't sleep in the same bed. They sleep in different rooms.
Yeah, it was the
And
same for my parents for a long time.
interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so with my father, the only way I was supposed to know he loved me was by providing. Just because he doesn't tell you he loves you, just because he doesn't say he's proud of you, doesn't mean anything because he provides the house you have and all the yada yada, all that stuff. But So when I got married, that's what I modeled. And it almost destroyed my marriage because I was not loving my wife the way that she needed to be loved. I was loving her the way that I loved, which was I just go to work. Like, I don't know, why do you say that that you don't feel loved by me? Don't you see that I'm providing the house and all the bills and blah blah blah? But
Yeah.
that's so limited because I didn't feel loved. I didn't love myself. So my only way of expressing that I loved her was by working because that's all I'd ever seen. And going back to your question with the narcissism, what I found very interesting looking back over my life, especially in high school, was I had almost a superiority complex, which made me an outsider. Was I felt that I was better than everyone and worse than everyone at the same time. Because if you saw me in practice playing basketball, you're like, oh man, that guy's going D1. You saw me in the game, it's like, why is this guy even on the court?
Yeah.
There'd be flashes of brilliance on the court, but it would only be when I would get out of my own head and out of my own way.
Yeah.
Because in practice, I was an incredible player. And I used to hear that all the time from the coaches. But when I got on the floor, they'd be like, what happened? It's because I did not want to disappoint them. I did not want to disappoint my parents because my parents would be in the crowd. So I overanalyzed every single decision that I made to a point where it destroyed me. And but on the regular basis, I was just I'm not going to associate with this person. This person's stupid. I don't relate to them, so I'm just going to be set apart from them. And that's a dangerous place to be. Yes, most if you look at the most successful people in history, you look at Steve Jobs, you look at Jeff Bezos, they are narcissists to a certain degree. They think of
Yeah.
themselves higher than everyone else. They think that they're better than everyone else, but that's what leads them to creating these mega machines, these mega companies and corporations because they feel that they are better than everyone else. But I think that it's a very dangerous place when it comes to talking about relationships. And that's why you see Bezos and you see Bill Gates, they went through divorces. Is when you think that you're better than everyone and you feel that you're set apart from everyone, when you get into a relationship, you're gonna to a certain degree feel that way about your spouse. You're gonna sit there and your partner, you're gonna say, I'm even if you don't say it out loud, the way that you treat them, because this is how I used to treat my wife, was I used to try to put her in her place by letting her know who paid the bills, by letting her know who made the most money, by letting her know that I almost use the lack of empathy and the lack of because her love language is physical touch, the lack of physical touch to control and manipulate the situation. And that's what led us to almost separating multiple times because I felt that I was better. And that's again, if you try to separate from everyone, you're going to be with no one because you have to be willing to open to somebody else and to feel at least in alignment enough to reveal certain aspects of yourself. Like everything I'm talking about, my wife knows and much more because I have this innate understanding, especially now looking back, that she is great in her own right. I am not better than her as a whole. There's things I'm much better at. I may be much better at speaking. I may be much better at budgeting. She's much better in different areas than I am. So that means that if you have these scales and balances, that we are equals. And we hear that word all the time about equality, but equality doesn't mean that you have to do the same exact thing as me. You had a marketing company that you sold. I may never get to that point. So does that make me lesser than? Or does that mean that in different areas we could be equals?
Yeah.
There's questions, and that's what I look at with people as well, is just because men may be physically capable of lifting more stuff, does that mean that we are superior to women? No. I'm pretty sure, and I've talked to my wife about this, that if I looked down and my private parts were just bleeding for no reason, I would probably just pass out. It's like, but y'all deal with that every month and just think it's normal.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or even when you think about childbirth, I just don't think that for me as a man that I would be able to go through that to carry an actual extra life around for 9 months and then push
Yeah.
this thing out and all the pain that is incorporated with it. There's just certain aspects that women are much better at. They're much better emotionally. 99% of the time, women are much more emotional because they're allowed to be. As girls growing up, they get to play with Barbies. They say, express yourself. They get to express their emotions. Men, at least for me growing up, and a lot of men that I've come in contact with, we're told to shut up, be quiet, to be a certain way. You can't cry. You can't talk about how you feel. You have to be one way. So that cuts off our emotional side. And that's what I've had to discover over it'll be 10 years this year of our marriage is the emotional side of me. And I'm just blessed and grateful that she stayed this long, that she stayed because we've been married almost 10, but we've been happily married about three, two and a half, three, because she stayed long enough for me to figure out to open back up to the emotional side. And that's been one of the greatest advantages I've had in life and in business, is actually being able to open to the emotional. Even as we talked about earlier about the M&As, if it's impersonal, even as we talked about with the text messages, if it's impersonal, people don't buy. It needs to, especially in this day and age, it needs to relate to you. It needs to relate to me, the consumer. Why do I want to buy from you? Okay, great. You're giving a certain percentage of sandals to people in South America. Maybe I don't care about people in South America. Why should I buy your sandals for me? Oh, it's going to make my feet hurt less. It's going to make me look cool. It's either going to boost your status or it's going to help solve a problem, and it's going to make it more personal, or maybe it's personalized. It's got my name on it. But especially as a business owner, working with other business people, or if just in community, not even for business people as a singularity, talking to people and being able to meet them on common ground and have empathy for what they're walking through or have walked through is going to build a much deeper relationship than if you just say, "Oh, you're in business, me too. What's your metrics look like? What's your KPIs? My KPIs are this." Like, no one cares if you're actually talking about it person to person.
Yeah.
If you want to build a real relationship with someone, you need to figure out what hurts for them, what hurts for you, and being able to see if you can meet them where the pain is. Because if you can relate to somebody's pain and just give them a hope for the future, that's where true connection is built.
Yeah. And everything you're saying falls in line with. I had a conversation with my buddy Mark Can. I think it might have been like the third or fourth podcast episode, and we dove into that. Where it's just like nobody gives a shit about nobody gives a shit about your business goals. Really, it's just like, who are you? Like what makes you tick? That's one of the reasons why I think we've talked about this. But whenever I talk with somebody and it's not even just business anymore. When I meet people often, I'll ask a variant of this question. And I got this from Blair Enns, whose his book Win Without Pitching is fantastic. Anybody that has any sort of even like remote business job or what, I'd recommend it to almost anybody just because it's just good to figure out how to frame things. But it's a great book. Sometimes there's those books, like business books, that like outside of the context, there's like a lot of value
Yep.
into it. Like More Than Two is a book about polyamory. I'm polyamorous, and I actually recommend people, even if they're straight monogamous, to read that book because it's just a fucking good book on how to have a happy relationship and a healthy relationship. The polyamory is just like an additional layer. But I think that that's one of the best books I've read on relationships. It's fantastic. So I love those things that kind of cross pollinate. Seems like they're the same way, but um, I'm curious. So you talk about that vulnerability and that empathy, and one of the things that came to mind is like earlier, the stability equals self interest, but the another end of that I'm now kind of seeing with more context is that love is responsibility.
Yep.
And so, like, there's this weird kind of circle where it's like, um, you know, I value stability over all else, and that requires my self-interest. But hey, like, you are my responsibility. Therefore, like, my love to you is the fact that I give you stability and I'm there and like basically it's not love, it's responsibility. Your mom confused love with responsibility. And it's weird because it all goes back to her. Like she's doing this thing and it makes her a good like it's interesting how they have that loop going. So I'm curious because it sounds like you started going down that path even in your own relationship with your wife. You started mirroring and reproducing that same kind of cycle, like, oh hey, like I don't need to give you physical touch or physical emotion. I'm the same way. Like I'm not a physical touch person. I'm like if you talk about the love languages, I'm more of an acts of service kind of
Me too.
person.
Yep.
Yeah, and my partner, she's a very physical touch. She's a very emotional side of things, and so we've had that same. It sounds like the exact same kind of conflict and resolution process that you and your wife have, where it's just like, okay, it's not necessarily that we're incompatible. It's that we need to learn how to translate.
Yep.
We need to learn how to see each other on our own, through our own lenses and the other person's lens as well, and see how we can do this. certain people are just incompatible. I think for us, like we just had to learn, that translation, if you will. Like the
Absolutely.
love is there and the good intent is there, but like, we're just speaking different languages. So um where was that? Because one of the things that you said is like vulnerability seems to have been the key of breaking that cycle. Like breaking that cycle of the that you kind of inherited from your parents of that rigid kind of thought process. So it seems to be like the vulnerability and the empathy. Like vulnerability from your perspective, but empathy from other people. So you had this kind of yin and yang kind of approach. Where did that where did that crack form? Because to me, like there's so many different alternative timelines, like what was it, the butterfly effect.
Yep.
There's so many alternative timelines where you just perpetuated, and maybe you were a little bit better and more self-aware than your parents, but I can see a whole lot of timelines in which you just would have kept going down that path. And you mentioned that like with your marriage, like really it's been like the last 3-4 years
Yeah.
where you guys really hit your stride. I understand that, in my own timeline's not as long as yours, about half of that, but it's the same thing. Last like 2-3 years really, with my relationship as well. I felt like it's almost like we started over in a way, where we changed. So, what caused that break? Like, what caused that crack in that cycle where you were able to like get outside of it?
Yeah, I think there was the part of me who wanted to look at when we first got together because I had this innate understanding that I couldn't quite explain. Where the second day on the job, we both worked in the movie theater, and
Okay.
I had no idea what I was
What
doing.
time was this? Like, what year do you think this was? Context.
2012 was,
Okay.
so this was 11 years ago.
Okay. Go on.
And when I was there at the movie theater, I didn't get trained. Like the person who trained me, he quit the next day. So I come in, I had no idea how to run the POS system, and I'm sweating because there's a line of people and I have no idea what I'm doing. I can't even get this thing unlocked. And
Yeah.
my now wife comes up behind me and she says, "Hey, do you need some help?" And I'm almost in tears. I'm just like, "Yes, please." And so she starts helping me. And I remember I turn around and she is bagging some popcorn. And because I'm working in the concession stand, and I had this innate understanding that she was supposed to be my wife. I'm 18. That makes no sense. And that at that moment, I was like, okay, that's crazy. That didn't make any sense. And I wanted to talk about that. But if I'm completely honest, the point that really shifted everything, and this is how most people are, is it came through pain. It did not come through a pleasurable moment like that one. It came through the pain of, I think we were, let's see, I think we were 3 years into our marriage, maybe four. And yeah, it's 3 or 4. And so, as we already heard, that I was very self-centered. I only took care of myself. I didn't show any physical attention to my wife. It got to the point with my wife where she one day was basically begging me on her knees to just hold her. She said, "Please just hold me." And I told her, I said, "I'm sorry, I can't be that person for you." And I just sit there and I look back on that moment and I go, how devastating would that be to hear? The person that
Yeah.
you
It's like
married, the person that you expected
your
to have
mom all over again.
exactly, to have a life
Yeah.
with, you are hearing that all of your dreams are crushed in a moment. And ultimately, what that led to was her having an affair. And so
Yeah.
when she had this affair, and it was not this smooth transition where I just found out all in one time. It was, there was bits and pieces that I was finding. It was like a breadcrumb, like a breadcrumb trail. And I was finding all of these different aspects of it. And then eventually the other guy's wife gets in contact and says, "This is what's actually happened." And it devastated me. It was the worst thing that ever happened to me. And but what was interesting was I again had another innate understanding that it was not her fault. It was mine. And anyone who I've told this story to who does not actually know how to self-reflect on their decisions say, "No, that's not your fault. That was her fault." But I pushed her. Yes, I didn't make the choice. She made the choice. Why did she make the choice? Ask the question of why did she get to that point? Did I have something to play in that? Or was I just the perfect model husband and she just for some reason did that? I always think that if the other person is doing actions that don't line up with who they were when you first met them, there's a reason. And that to a certain degree, it stems from you. Yes, there was something in her as well. But I noticed every single action I had taken was something that my parents would have done, even as you said, and it pushed her away. She wanted to love me. she wanted to give me all of her, and I wanted none of her. I wanted her to just be submissive. And that pushed her to meeting an emotional and a physical need somewhere else.
Yeah.
So that moment of sheer and utter pain, where I'm sitting there and we had this picture and it said our anniversary date, and I'm throwing it across the room and it shatters everywhere. I'm all these things, and I just remember all the anger and the hurt. And I remember getting in the truck that was way too expensive, and I had my son loaded up, and I was about to leave. I told her, I said, I'm done. And I get in the truck, and right as I'm about to leave, she's standing in front of the truck and she's crying, and I'm upset, but she won't move. And I just had, in a moment, I just looked at her and I realized I needed her. And I realized that every decision that I had made in our marriage pushed her there. When I got out of the truck, she asked me, she said, Steven, I just need 2 years. Because statistically, if you stay together for 2 years after that break point, that is when the marriage gets whole again. And I told her, I gave her an ultimatum. I said, I will stay, but if anything else happens, I'm gone. No questions asked. And I said, do you accept those terms and conditions? I don't know. I guess I turned into Apple whenever they do an update, but they, she said yes, and we're still here. And we have a beautiful marriage now because, and the thing is the man of the house is supposed to lead. You're supposed to lead and show her how to be loved. You're supposed to show her what is different than you, what's different in you than her father. Why could she not find that love somewhere else? And I had to become someone else in a certain sense. I had to become a better version of myself. I had to become a version of myself that I'd never seen. I had never had love. I didn't know how to love. I had never been physically loved on. So I did not know how to physically love. So I had to break that cycle by just holding her at night, even though I hated it. Like I hated holding her. I didn't like the feeling of it.
Yeah.
It made me too hot. I wanted to just sleep. It I had to do certain things like just take her hand in public or whatever it was, just touch her, just give her a hug. I had to push myself as if it was going to the gym and working out. I had to push myself to do the things I didn't like instead of just, well, I'm taking care of the house. I'm cooking for you. I did whatever. Those are acts of service. Her top love language is physical touch, so acts of service was like really low. It didn't matter.
Sure.
But that pushing my boundaries of what I was comfortable in to meet her physical needs, that is where we started joining back together, and now we have a great relationship because I started looking back over my life, even as I'm doing now on this podcast, and saying, okay, what decisions did I make that have equivalated to the person I'm at right now? And is that the person I want to be in the future? Is that the person I want to be in 10 years? Is that the person I want my son modeling? Is that the person that my wife stays with? If the answer is no, then what do I need to let go of now? And
Yeah.
and you got to do that introspective work almost on a daily basis and really working on your heart. What's there that's not yours, that's been given to you and you've just picked it up? Because most people get Christmas gifts and some of those Christmas gifts suck. Are you still holding on to them or have you sent it to Goodwill? So
Yeah.
for me, I want to sit there and look at the things that suck in my life that I suck at and say, what's going on here? Is this something that I gave myself or is it something that someone else gave me? And how can I let go of this? Because until you get a good perspective on who you are and who you truly are, not who your parents made you be, not who your friend groups made you be, until you can get a perspective on who you truly are, you'll never love the person that you're with the way that they need to be loved. And especially if you have a family, you'll never love the next generation the way that you need to be loved because you don't, because the kid that, like, and this is me speaking to me, but the kid that I have, there's been, especially when he was younger, he was getting parented the way I got parented, yelled at, screamed at, told to go away, told to be in his room, all the different things because I was parenting him the way I was parenting because that same kid inside of me at that age was not healed. He was still hurt. He still remembers what it felt like. And he wanted the next generation to feel the same way. Because if they feel the same way, they can empathize with me and understand where I'm coming from and why they need to obey me because of the decisions that were given to me, not even decisions that I got to actually make. Interesting.
Yeah. And so on that note, like when you were describing the situation with the affair, it's like thinking about it from your perspective, you've been emotionally detached for most of your life. And, it sounds like there was a lot of, you know, trigger points throughout your life that cause that, but the big one that comes to mind is your mom being like, "I don't love you." And so you just completely emotionally shut down, and now you just didn't trust. Like, you thought your mom loved you, maybe she had a weird way of going about it, and maybe she wasn't the best at it, but, being a kid, you wanna think that, "Hey, my mom loves me, of course," and then she's just like, "I don't," you know? Uh, I mean, it's just shattering, like, how do you trust anybody? The person, the person you're supposed to be able to trust the most in your life, one of your parents, you no longer can trust them. Who the hell else are you supposed to trust, particularly someone you haven't even known that long? So you went about it with the relationship with your now wife, and you kind of had that guardedness. And for me, it was definitely the same way. I've been like that my whole life. It's so weird. People are so perplexed because, like, on this show and everything else, I'll talk about anything.
Yep.
Like, I will talk about anything, my suicide attempts, all my
Same.
greatest insecurities, as long as it's not, doxing people in my personal life to some extent,
Yeah.
there's some stuff it's just like I can't, I even think about that even with my parents, like how much do I want to share about that? But it's just like I can't. That's so fundamental to me. It's kind of hard not to share that to some extent because otherwise you just don't like what you're doing right now. You just don't get the context,
Yep.
you know. So also it's just like, hey, you birthed me. I think I'm owed that, a little bit. But still, like I think about that. But people think the weird thing is that I am so vulnerable and open with people, and I am deeply emotional when it comes to empathy. But when it comes to me, it's like I can't be reached. I have a really hard time emotionally, deeply, deeply connecting with people in like any sort of romantic way because I don't trust it.
Mhm.
It's not even that I don't trust it. It's like I don't know how to like take like I always imagine I'm like in a dark void somewhere
Yep.
and I'm just floating and there's some sort of like tether that's supposed to connect to somebody and it's just not there. I wanna connect with that person, but I don't know how, you know? And like, my partner now, she's the only person I've really been able to truly do that with, and even then, like, there's times when I'm just like, I don't know how to bring that out, and I want to, That's something I'm probably gonna be working on for the rest of my life. But for you, it's like, I've been in that circumstance many, many times myself where you find yourself sitting across from somebody and staring them in the eye and being like, "Oh, fuck, I'm doing exactly to you what I've had done to me." And you have that moment of horror, like, "Fuck, I'm perpetuating this shit. I don't want to. Oh my god." So for you, it's like, to me, I have to imagine the biggest rug pull, probably one of the biggest rug pull, if not the most in your life, is like, "Oh, I actually don't love you." And now you you've been all your conditioning is around that, and then with your wife having this like affair, it just reaffirmed that to a crazy degree that like, oh, this person you thought that loved you doesn't. At least
Yep.
at least like your perspective of that,
Mhm.
your perspective of that is like, oh fuck. So you just detach further. What like, we talked about, like, how you process that as far as taking ownership, which I think is huge, and fucking congrats for that. Well, a lot of people don't, but what was your side of it, though? Like, how did you ground yourself and be like, "No, this detachment, like, this is on me. This is in my head. This is not on her." Like, again, there's that tangible ownership of it, but how did you kind of like turn a freight train around with the detachment part, emotionally detaching yourself, you know?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting because you and I are completely different people, but the same. I've walked through many suicide attempts.
Trauma bonding.
Exactly, yeah. But I've walked through many suicide attempts. The imagery that you talk about with being in the void. That's
Yeah.
the imagery that I use for a lot of my life. There was actually two images. One, because I used to see anger so much, I used to think that anger equaled power. So
Mm.
for me is when I would get angry, I used to see in the void of all places, I used to see. Have you ever listened to Disturbed, the rock band?
Just a couple of their
Okay,
songs.
so
It's
Disturbed has their, I don't know, their mascot is this really demonic, evil looking monster thing. And I used to see this thing in the void. And I used to think,
Mhm.
okay, this thing has chains around it, but it's not chained to anything. So that means it's broken free of something. And that equals it's powerful. So I used to think that anger equaled power. And I used to think that the more angry I was, the more fired up I was, that means I was more powerful. And that stemmed from seeing it as a kid. And especially when I think about the void, I never let anyone in.
Mm,
Growing up,
yeah.
I never wanted to let anybody in because I've had that thought process that everyone's going to hurt me. No one actually cares about me. No one loves me. And even as you said, when that moment happened, the affair happened. It it just affirmed my belief system that obviously I was right. Even because, and the crazy thing is that every girlfriend that I had cheated on me. And
Huh.
so it was not only just a belief system that happened at the affair. It was already built beforehand. That's what made me even more detached when I got married. And I think that especially with the way that you use the imagery with you're in the void and there's this tether and there's supposed to be a tether ring, was once I made the verbal decision to stay and I'd let her know I will give you 2 years. But if something happens, I'm gone, no questions asked. Was I said if that's gonna be my truth that I'm gonna stay, I'm going all in. And if I'm going all in, like you're at a poker table, you don't leave some chips off the table. I went all in. And I just said, what do I have to lose? I'm gonna throw open the gates and I'm gonna be as emotionally vulnerable as possible. I'm gonna cry. If I feel like crying, I'm gonna cry. If I feel happy, I'm gonna be happy. If I feel angry, I'm gonna be angry. I'm gonna show all my emotions. I'm gonna tell her about why I'm this way. What were the decisions? What were the things I experienced that led me to this? I'm gonna sit there and open up to her about having a pornography addiction. She didn't know that until 6 years into our marriage. I had hid that thing so well, she didn't know. And she didn't even have an inkling until I told her. But I just said, if we're going to do this, I'm going all in. And I opened up every single floodgate. All the things that nobody knew, she knows. Because at the end of the day, if she cheated again, I was gone anyways. It wasn't as if I had anything to lose, but I had everything to gain. So that was that moment in the void where I just threw her the rope. And I said, what are you going to do with it? Are you going to help me up or are you going to choke me out with it? And if you
Yeah.
choke me out with it, I was already in the void. Like, what was I going to lose? But if she pulled
Yeah.
me up and we were able to make that connection, I had everything to gain because I at least knew that I would have one person in my life that would have full access to me and would be able to see things in me that I couldn't see because of who she knows that I am. And that's what's happened is she's been able to speak life into me in areas, even with the business. She's been able to say, hey, the reason why this is happening in the business is because of your mindset around this. And I've been able to say, wow, that's so true. The limiting beliefs that I'm holding on to is what's limiting the physical business aspect of it. Or even as a parent, hey, the way that you're parenting the way your parents parented you, and it's because you're still hurt from this moment in your life. But the only way she can
Yeah.
do that is because I just told her everything. I opened up every drawer, every door, everything in the house. That way she could see it all. And that I had to do it with the understanding that if she was all in with me the way she was saying, she would help me be the best version of me. And I would finally have that one person that I could attach to because I'd been so detached my whole life. And at the end of the day, if we're honest, we all long to be attached. We've been so detached for all of our lives. And when you're a one man show, even emotionally and internally, there's a longing for attachment. And it's the fear that if you attach to the wrong person, that they're just going to hurt you even worse and you're going to withdraw and recluse even further. And again, this is the same thing I said was I was just willing. I was just willing to just go all in and just give her everything because there was already the signed agreement that if it went the other way, I was just gone. Like I was gonna just be reclused anyways. So why not?
Yeah. For sure. Um, do you find yourself liking touch and that kind of physical touch, the emotional side more now that you've been able to kind of bridge, like tether more with your wife? Because for me, it's still not my default. It's still not something that it's something sometimes I still struggle with where I can tell that like, my partner needs more than, and I'm just kind of almost like, okay, like I can give this to you. It still kind of takes energy from me sometimes, I guess is a good way of putting it. But I do find myself significantly more than when we first started doing that, like, um, getting like it not draining me as much and like appreciating it more because it creates this kind of like feedback loop in a way. So is that the same for you?
Yes, absolutely. Now I am if you saw us now, you would think that I always physical touch was one of the highest ones. Physical touch, what is very interesting because I had to change my brain around it, actually,
Huh.
where I had to because physical touch was dead last. And I had to push out and, hold her more, hold her hand more, do all the things, touch her all the time. I made it an exercise every day, how most people make an exercise to do 10 outreaches in the morning or 10 cold calls. I made it an activity where I was going to push myself to touch her every single day, at least this many times. And I actually took the test recently to see where does physical touch land now, and it's third, and it's actually it could interchange with 2. So it's in the top percentile for things that I truly enjoy now because I actually changed my brain's makeup by forcing myself to do something long enough where I enjoy it. And
Yeah.
that's that piece of it, especially one thing that I notice most is because of that tethering piece, now that I'm tethered to her, I'm attached to her, is her emotions have almost become my emotions and vice versa. If I'm good if I'm good and she's bad, I can help her be good just through my emotional well-being. The same with her. If I'm bad and she's good, she doesn't have to say anything to me. I can just feel the emotions off of her and it actually puts me at a different level. So when I can feel that she is lacking in physical touch, I just touch her. And I do it early and often because that strengthens that tether. It takes a maybe a string and turns it into a rope, or it takes a rope and turns it into a cable, because I want to give her everything she needs. So that's why, even on a very granular level, I'm very active in how I meet those needs. I wake up in the morning because everyone has more than just physical touch or acts of service. So I wake up and I cook breakfast. I will help clean up the house. I will touch her. I will maybe go get her a little gift. A little gift could be a bag of chips. Hey, I was at the store. I thought about you. I got you this. Whatever it is, I try to meet her needs and as a full in the full scope of things. I try to meet every one of them because then she'll feel overwhelmingly loved because I'm meeting the big one and I'm meeting all the rest too. And the only way that I did that was through actively pushing because it was not my initial, it took years to get to the point where I actually just love touching her. I actually just love loving her. It took, I don't know, probably the last 3 years of just actively doing it, making it an activity that I put on the schedule. I'm going to do this. And you can even schedule it in. I'm going to touch her at 8 a.m. I'm going to hold her hand at 2 p.m. But if
Yeah.
you, for me, I'm a very analytical person. So I needed to do it on a granular level that way. So she didn't have to know that, but it made it, and it almost added to the air of spontaneity. She would think it's spontaneous. Why does it feel like he's holding me at 8 a.m.? Why did he decide to take my hand randomly at 2? Why did he want to cuddle at right before he went to bed at 9? Why did he want to do these things? And it adds that air of spontaneity to it, and that helps her feel loved in a sense where it's not my watch going off and it's like, oh well, time to hold hands. You ready? It's like,
Yeah.
no, it's you want them to feel met where they are. And that's the same thing with empathy, is whatever emotion somebody's feeling is meeting them there. If they're talking about being in the midst, because there was somebody that talked to me about this the other day, where they held a gun to their head and were about to commit suicide, and there was things that helped them get out of that. And I was just able to relate to it. That I remember having a shotgun to the bottom of my head. Now it was unloaded, but my mindset was I'm going to kill myself at some point, and just being able to meet them where they're at.
So I want to get into that loaded shotgun moment. But let's take a break real quick, and then we'll jump into that. We've been bouncing around a little bit,
Mhm.
but we've got um, essentially like your childhood up until like there's that there's that gap between childhood and like you working at the warehouse and doing the logistics. And then we've got a good amount like after that, like sort of around the same time, like with your marriage. Um, and then everything up until the present. So where does the shotgun situation, like where does that play in? Is that before all this we talked about
No,
with the marriage or after?
it's
Before?
before. Yeah, I was actually still living at home. I think I was 16.
Okay. So let's dive into that. Because I want to take like from that point up until right around I guess getting up to maybe like the last couple years. So
Okay.
we'll kind of fill that gap in. And then one of the things that I really want to get into is your faith, because I am not a religious person. I am quite the opposite on the end of faith. I don't really, and that's one of the things that's so interesting to me because it's so integral to you, and I want to have a better understanding of that. So I want to get into that as well, just to kind of like put that in the forefront. But I think that makes probably the most sense to talk about when we get to like the big pivots that you made a couple years ago, because
Hmm.
that's I feel like that's a good point. But anyway, um, all right, let me pour this and then we'll get going. Alrighty, and we're back. So shotgun. We we kind of like got into your childhood and then kind of bounced around a little bit. But what? So you were in school, you were playing sports, and you had like this kind of perfectionism. You had a lot of all these things going on with your parents. What kind of where were things from there that kind of got you to like the next phase of your life that kind of led into that?
Yeah, no, when we're talking about the shotgun, that I think I was gifted that shotgun for, well, I'm growing up in the South, you're always like gifted a gun at some point in
Yeah.
time. I was gifted the shotgun sometime in my teenage years. And I just remember one time my mom and I were in some kind of heated, I would call it a heated discussion. And I had the shotgun and I kept it unloaded, but I had it and I just put the barrel up to the bottom of my chin and my mom freaked out. And of course, like you parents should at that moment, she just freaked out. And wasn't doing that as a show of force that, hey, if this doesn't go my way, I'm gonna blow my head off right here. But it was related to how I actually felt. If I really dive into that story and that understanding in the moment, was there was times that my parents didn't even know about that I've shared recently. Is that there was a time that I was going to hang myself and make sure that they found me, and I think that that's a lot of. There's been people that I've met that they've had a loved one or a friend commit suicide, and there was one time, and it's very very sad. Every single situation. There was one time this kid had basically made, if anyone's ever seen the movie Saw, he made his own saw contraption to kill himself. And
Jeez.
he did it to where he had connected it to the door. So whenever his dad would come in to his room, it would activate this thing that would in turn kill him.
Wow.
And so his dad did that. His dad opened the door and it ends up killing his son. And you just think of that and you go, why? Why would
Yeah.
this kid go through the effort of constructing something just so his father saw it take place? It's because he had been hurt in the past, probably by his father, and it was a cry for, really a cry for help. It was a cry for just an attachment, a cry for a somebody, like anyone, please anyone, just hear me, feel me. I may not be speaking to you, but you can tell by the way that I'm dressed, the way that I'm speaking, the way that I'm carrying myself that something's not right. And it just feels that nobody cares. It feels that everywhere I go, everyone expects me to be good. Everyone, especially for me playing sports, is everyone just thought I was good. I had to be set apart from everyone else. And that made it feel so damaging to me because it felt like nobody knew and nobody cared. So I didn't care about me because nobody else cared about me. So I was just like, I'm just gonna kill myself. I don't want to be on this planet. There's nothing good come out of it. Everyone's against me. My own mom has a detachment issue with me. My dad, now that I'm a teenager, he's flipped to where it seems like he just hates me. So why do I live? Why do I exist? And that's what, even though the gun was unloaded, the shotgun was unloaded, the actual imagery there was to show my parents, this is where I'm at. Is I'm at this point where I truly don't want to live because there's nothing for me to live for. I think I was 16. Yeah, probably 16. And basketball and video games in my life. And at that time, video games was not as popular as it is now. And so there was nothing really there for me. Back in our day, growing up, there was MLG. You had MLG, you had Major League
Yeah.
Gaming, and that was huge. But or Machinima. Machinima, most people I have no idea what Machinima is, but that was a huge YouTube channel back in the day about gaming. And that's that was the only thing that was cool about gaming. Everything else you were considered a nerd if you played games. And I loved video games and I loved basketball, and neither of those things were going to be the perpetuation of my life. I was never going to be a professional athlete. I was not going to be a professional Fortnite player because it didn't exist. And so I didn't have anything to anchor myself to say this is what gives me meaning. I never saw meaning in going and working a job and being there until I'm 65 and then quitting, and all my best years are behind me. It's like, wait, I'm supposed to go work every single day or at least 5 days a week for the rest of my life. Like, I don't even get summer breaks anymore. But for the rest of my life, I'm supposed to work this thing at the minimum 40 hours a week for 30 plus years. And then I'll be able to retire and enjoy my life. But why? That just didn't seem right to me. So
Yeah.
I'm not going to make it that long. Because I had this innate feeling that I was going to die before I was 20, or I wasn't going to make it to 25. And so I just thought I'm just going to live however I want to live, and I'm not even going to make it that far anyway. So I might as well just die now. Just shortcut it. But that's where that all played in, was at that younger age of 16. And then as we were talking about with the marriage and everything else, that was probably 20. That had to be 2017. So that was 2017 that all happened. And I remember we lived in Tennessee at that time. One of the big driving forces that I believe really saved our marriage was not only the attachment going all in. That going all in did not happen overnight. It took years for me to be able to be willing to go all in. And one of the biggest things that saved our marriage and transformed who I am was moving away. Grew up in Tennessee, grew up in the same city my entire life. So once I got a promotion and moved to Fort Worth, Texas, we were 14 hours away. There was nobody there. And I had extended family there that I didn't know. They were actually from Hawaii. But when we moved there, the money was stretched. So I had to rely on her. We had to rely on each other. And one of the big things, again, going back to even what we said towards the beginning of the podcast, was you are the sum of the 5 people you spend the most time with. And we hear that in business and with finances, but that's the truth no matter what aspect of your life. If you spend all of your time with 5 fat people, you eventually going to get fat because you're just going to join in with exactly what they're doing. And so from us, so you had my family with all of their qualms, all their issues. And then you also have my wife's family who it's a lot. And what's really crazy is I thought that if I personally still hold my family and my parents in a higher esteem than my wife's, because
Okay.
which is crazy now that we're talking about all this, but I
Yeah.
couldn't,
Yeah.
I could not stand, and I still have issues with her family, because her family was very much, I just remember right before we moved, her sister would just show up at our door and just drop her kids off and leave without even
Gee.
asking. She
Uh.
would just, and I worked nights. So I'm sitting there, I just got off of a 16-hour shift and I'm hearing a doorbell ring and knocks at the front door. I'm upset because that's just how they are. And it's always the conversations that they have are very manipulative. All of them. We had the opportunity to go volunteer and go. We actually were in Atlanta not too long ago, a few weeks ago, and it was my son's birthday. So they drove down from Chattanooga, Tennessee to Atlanta. It's about an hour and a half, 2 hours, and they spent time with him. Well, the hotel that we were in, we had 2 beds. So my mother-in-law came and she stayed with us. She hadn't seen us in months. Why is the first question that you have about why are you acting like this? Why are you talking like that? Why don't you sound like this? What's wrong with him? This is the first time you've seen us in months. Why does it feel as if you're trying to nitpick our entire lives when we just got here? Like,
Yeah.
you just got here and we're here for volunteer work. Like, we're here to do, we've been going all day. You're seeing us after a 14 to 16-hour day. We're tired.
Yeah.
And it's not as if we're doing anything wrong. It's just, hey, we're tired right now. We're going to go to bed. What's wrong with you? Why do you act this way? It's like, are you okay? Do we need to go to the hospital? It's like, are you serious? And that's how her family has always been. And it was, even after I stayed, after the affair, my wife was in that phase where she was becoming very much like her mom, and that's how her mom is and has always been. And her mom has also been through, I think it's 4 or 5 failed marriages. So I, t- to put it plainly, is us being there was only going to go one way.
Yeah.
I didn't have the example with my parents on how to have a stable relationship. They were basically two roommates at that point. And now that I'm out of the house, they it's been really cool watching them now. They've actually started to attach to each other. They actually have real conversations that I never had witnessed until the past few years. And even my parents attribute a lot of that to who I've become. And because I've shown them that you don't have to be one way. This isn't, and I feel really bad for that generation because it's an entire generation of people, the boomers, the baby boomers,
Yeah. Yeah.
where they all they saw was work. My grandmother, she went through the Great Depression. Actually, she didn't. Her dad did. So if your parent had went through the Great Depression where you had lost everything living in a tent city, and that's how you raised your kids, then that's just going to perpetuate down the line until somebody breaks it. And so I felt really bad for my parents, but now them being able to see how I'm different, how my wife and I, our relationship is different, it allows them to say, hey, we can do this too. We're retired. Why not just try it? But that us moving away and going to Fort Worth was the best decision that we ever made. Even though the finances weren't right, that's where we ended up going bankrupt. But our marriage bank was full. Our love bank was full because we loved one another. There was no one telling us who we had to be, who we needed to be. Why are you guys this way? Why aren't you this way? It was just us. And we could create whatever we wanted to create. And that's one of those things, even now, 'cause at one point in time, we lived in Tennessee again before we came to Oklahoma. And in Tennessee, we were close enough where family could just drive up. We're a couple hours away from them, but they would just drive up and it'd be the same thing. It'd just be draining. We'd sit there, or when I lived in East Texas, we would go over there for Christmas or the holidays, 11-hour drive. And I would need a vacation from the vacation because it was just like the energy was almost the same as a leech. They would just leech on and take everything from you. And I couldn't stand being around her family because that's just, I feel drained every single time. It feels as if there's every conversation they have is how terrible their life is. Every conversation they have is how they can never get ahead in life, even though they're the ones putting themselves behind. And every conversation is how everyone else is the problem and not them. So I don't want to spend time around the people that don't have at least the same outlook of where they want their life to go. If you have no control, I want to be around people who at least have a understanding that they control it. Like for me, if I can sit there and say that I caused the affair, that's the worst pain that most people will feel. So if I can say that I have a lot of responsibility in that, why can you not take responsibility that you got pulled over for running a red light? Well, that cop shouldn't have been sitting there. You broke
Uh,
the law.
yeah.
That doesn't make any sense. Take responsibility.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's that moving away, that was instrumental in our success.
Sounds like it. Also, it's just like, I don't know. But for me, I would also really worry about, the whole, five people you spend your most time with when it comes to your kids. Like, do you want your
Hmm.
kids around that fucking shit? Because I wouldn't. I mean, I don't know. If that, it, how is that conversation, if you don't mind getting into it, like with your wife, as far as like that, like how do you manage, like, okay, we got to self edit this a little bit, because I mean, first of all, motherfucker shows up at your door at 9 p.m. and it's just like, hey, here's the kids. It's like, no, I'll do it this one time, and then it's never happening again. And it's just like, that's so fucking toxic and selfish, and also impractical. Like, what if you guys just weren't there?
Yeah.
Or it's just like, like, what was she gonna do? Like, she clearly didn't think that through very well. But yeah, I mean, how do you navigate that? Because just like, on one hand, my family is very, very small now. And there's certain family members that like I just don't talk to. Most of my family doesn't talk to, and like they're effectively just dead to us, you know.
Yep.
And I don't foresee that ever changing, you know. And so it's just like you know, you always kind of wonder, like, you know, well, you know, is it worth trying again? And it's just like, no, probably not. You know, they haven't shown any real reason to think otherwise. So I think there's a benefit, obviously, to like having that family, but also it's just like I would have to imagine when you got kids, you're just like, okay, is this a net positive or a net negative to them? You know? So how have you guys navigated having that conversation?
I think that it's been much easier for me because you may relate to the fact that for me, especially growing up with my dad teaching me that people had no interest in my life at all, that I learned how to cut people off really quick. And it was
Sure.
not a paper. When I cut you off, it was completely severed. That relationship severed.
Door's
And
open.
I watched that with my dad. It was his niece just made a comment about how he laughed. And she was in full expectancy that she was just joyful. She was, laughing along with him and just saying, "Oh, your laugh sounds like Santa Claus." And he got so offended that he stopped speaking to her to this day. That was years ago. That was probably 10 years ago, all about a comment. So when you grow up seeing him do stuff like that, it was probably more than 10 years. It had to be when I still lived there in the house. So it had to be almost, I don't know, 12 to 13 years ago. Still won't speak to her. And he still talks about that one event. So there's a lot of unforgiveness. And that when I sit there and I think about that, when it comes to her family, is it's easy for me to be like, I'm never speaking to them. I don't like them. They don't align with where I'm going in my life. They just leech off of us in every aspect. Why would I?
Yeah.
And so I don't. I actually, if I'm honest, I do when they ask me something. If they reach out to me, and it's only if they ask me the right question will I respond.
Yeah.
Just a few minutes ago, right before we took the break, my mother-in-law, she messaged me and said, "Hey, I've been trying to get in contact with Brittany, that's my wife, and I haven't heard from her for a long time. I just want to make sure she's okay." And I said, "Yeah, we're good. We've just been doing a lot of business stuff, a lot of volunteer work." And she said, "Okay, I just want to make sure everything was all right." I will respond to that because I want her to have a peace of mind that her daughter is okay.
Sure. Yeah.
But when it's even my so I don't even know what to consider, but my brother-in-law, I guess, is so my wife's sister's husband. He has that same complex where it's everyone else's fault. And so when he reaches out to me, I never respond to him. It is the rarest thing. And if I do respond to him, I go outside to see if it's a full moon or not. And the only reason is he asks, and I've experienced this. I'm sure you've experienced people like this, where they'll sit there and they'll tell you all about their problem, and you will have the answer and the solution, and say, "Hey, if you just do this one thing, it'll solve that exact problem." It's like, "Oh, thank you so
No,
much."
no, that's not gonna work.
Or they'll be like, "Yeah, it's not
Yeah.
gonna work at all. There's no
Yeah.
way that could equivalate to my situation." No, this is if you do this one thing, it'll fix it. But
Yeah.
he's that way. He's always been that way the whole time I've known him for 10 years. So I don't respond. It's not worth it to me. It's not worth getting into delving into this conversation with someone who's not willing to get help. I heard
Yeah.
this from somebody in the business space. They talked about the philosophy behind a lifeguard. They asked the lifeguards or the Coast Guard. They asked the Coast Guard, when there's a ship sinking and you hear that SOS, who do you choose to save first? And they said, we save the people that are swimming towards us first. So if this person is sitting on the boat, like this is Titanic and they're going to go down with the ship, why would I go to them and try to save them? And when there's people right there swimming towards me that actually want to get helped.
Yeah.
And so that's been my thought process. And with my wife, it's been much more, it's been years for us working through it. And it's hard for her because it's her family.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
that's why the physical boundaries of being far away, the physical boundaries of not being close, being hours away, has made it much easier for her to not have that communication. Even as I just said, that she hasn't talked to her mom in a long time. It's been a week or two. And
Yeah.
as long as the communication doesn't impede the trajectory of my wife, I don't really care. As long as if you can sit there and have a little conversation and it doesn't impact her where I see her be more negative or more cynical or whatever it may be, then I'm just like, okay, cool. Check in with them, love on them. It's still your family. You didn't choose them, but you got them. So while you got them, at least love on them. And that bit has been much easier being moved away because she doesn't talk to him as much. But having those physical boundaries and those physical limitations, that's so much better than when we lived in Tennessee and we're only 2 hours away because they would just show up and or they would or my wife would say, "Hey, so my mom is coming up tomorrow," and I'm just like, Wait,
Uh, yeah.
why is she coming up tomorrow?" Well, she took off and she really wanted to hang out with us for the wait, hold on. Why?
Yeah.
And so having those physical boundaries where she can't just show up makes it much easier.
Yeah, for sure. And I think there's also like kind of an emotional element to it as well, where it's just like Tim Ferriss talks about, traveling helping to remove some of the calcification in your thinking. So like, you know, whenever I have like a really difficult life decision to make, or I just feel kind of stuck, I'll go out of town, preferably to a place that I haven't been before.
Mm,
And it gives you clarity. You don't have all this calcified thinking. I mean, I'm sure most people that have kind of conflicted experiences with their family, like you go back to Thanksgiving dinner and or something like that, and you're around those people, you start to feel like those old, you know,
mhm,
patterns come back, and maybe you find yourself shutting down emotionally, or maybe you find like you start kind of going back into your old routine and patterns, and people treat you that way too.
yep,
You know, so like I've known that with some people. Fuck, I know some people that are founders and really successful, like astronomically more successful than the people in their family. And they'll go back to, families, gathering, Christmas, whatever, and they'll go there. And those people, like their uncle or their aunt or whoever the problem person is, will start talking to them like they're like, 12 again. And we'll just, and they'll do that to kind of keep that control in a way,
mhm,
oh, you're Mr. Successful or Mrs. Successful person, whatever. And they'll start bossing them around. And it's really quite sad. So, I mean, I have to imagine that for you guys just getting the hell out of there, it's easier for you and your wife just to kind of feel like you are who you actually are rather than these impressions and these shadows of like, who you used to be.
mhm,
So for me, yeah, like I always try and get out of town, and I feel like that gives me clarity, or I can make a better, I guess a more objective life decision. That happened with me when I was decided to leave my agency. I went to a little town and on Lake Michigan, and I just kind of sat there on the pier by the beach that they had, and I just really thought about it, a lot. Like, what would I do if I have 12 months left to live? Which really gets you thinking really quick. Like, is what I'm doing good or not? And the question was, I wouldn't be doing anything that I'm
wow,
full stop. And so that's where I'm like, okay, well, what does that look like? And eventually it's like, okay, I need to travel. I need to get out of this responsibility. If I stay with this business, I'm always going to be tethered to it, even if I'm able to do it remote. And it just became very clear, like, what the next steps were. Um, so I'm kind of curious, like, you had you had this corporate job that you did, and what made the change, like, for you, where you got to a point where you've made pivots in your life, you've always kind of had this entrepreneurial spirit, but maybe you never really fully flexed it. What was the point where you're just like, I can't do this anymore?
when I think back on that, I sit there and I relate it back to when I was 20 and my wife was 19. We got married. 6 months later, our son came along, and then she didn't wanna go back to work. So she jumps into an MLM, and I watch her just put her head down and get to work. I watch her Instagram following. She starts an Instagram, goes from 0 to 10,000 followers. I watch her start making $500 a month, which is nothing really. But I sit there and I see $500 a month from her being at home all the time, and I'm going to work all the time. And I just go, wait, you can do that from the house?
Yeah,
And so I told her, I said, hey, two heads are better than one. Quit the job, went all in on the MLM with no skills and no money. So we lost everything and moved into the basement. But especially after coming out of that, going through corporate, in 2018, so in 2018, my wife is a full time stay at home mom. I was making enough money working in corporate America that she could stay home and all of our needs were met and then some. And she felt unfulfilled. She hated it. She said, "There's only so much cleaning you can do, and only so many Netflix shows you can watch." And so she makes a post on Facebook, which is a cardinal sin when you
Yeah.
don't feel good about something. So she just puts up that, "Hey, I feel unfulfilled. I don't feel like I'm the purpose I'm supposed to be," something along those lines. And my mom reaches out to her and says, "Hey, I've been doing Amazon for the last year. I want to show you the opportunity and just see if you want to be a part of it." So my mom shows my wife this opportunity with Amazon, and I think it's on a Friday. And so my wife comes to me Saturday morning and she said, "Hey, this is what your mom was showing me. What do you think about it?" And I told her no. I said, "We're not doing that." I said, "The last time we were in business together, we got burned. We lost everything." I said, "We're finally in a good place. No way." I said, especially not with my mom. I said, "I've seen my mom go from one thing to another thing to another thing to another thing my entire life. And that was one of the reasons why she was never around. She used to always be trying to build the next thing without building the first thing." And so I told her, I said, "You don't have my support." I tell her no. And she had a conversation with my mom that Monday because they'd already scheduled the meeting. And my mom asked my wife, "Hey, do you want to do it?" And my wife just says, "Yeah, let's do it." So my wife goes straight against everything I just said. And I watched the house go from pristine to destroyed every single day. I'm working 14 plus. So I'm upset. And I'm sitting there and I'm the most unsupportive spouse ever. I'm giving her down the road. I'm sitting there just saying, "I can't believe you letting it look like this. I can't believe our son's in this situation," all the stuff. But one day during the week, I came home really late after a 14-hour shift and I noticed that she was awake. House was destroyed, but she was up working. And I remember going to bed. She was in the bed working on the laptop. I go to bed. I wake up. She's up, already working. So I go, wait, I work 14. She went to bed after I went to bed. She's up before I'm up. She's working at the minimum 17 plus. I said, she's outworking me. So once I realized that I had more time than she did, that's when I started picking up the chores. I started cleaning up the house and helping her out. And I also, the other part in my brain that really sparked it because I watched her go from someone where she would get a return or a bad feedback on Amazon. I watched her go from that to the end of 2019, building $1 million business and having 6 employees and doing over 19,000 transactions. I watched her become this person and I was blown away. Now, granted, that was top line sales and our actual net profit was 100,000 and then split between us and my mom was like 50K. And then after taxes and everything, we made much less than I made. Well, it was like 50K split, but then the way that we constructed it was like so much went back into the business for
Sure. Yeah.
all that crap. And so I made much more working in corporate. And so when towards this was going into 2020, and I'd made this decision that I was going to help them because I was already part of the supply chain. I was a supply chain operations manager. So I understood the influx, outflux of things, how to manage teams, and they didn't. So we went to a conference together. I started giving instruction, started helping build out the structures in the company. We hard pivoted away from that business model, which was drop shipping on Amazon, went more into like wholesaling, uh, online arbitrage, and then I think it was May of 2020, I started having anxiety attacks. And this is, I typically do talk about this part, but the context is never there. The context of my entire life that we've walked through, the parents I had, all the situations I walked through, I never had them. I never had anxiety attacks
Uh,
until May of 2020. In May of 2020, I started having these anxiety attacks and I didn't quite understand it. Well, and looking back, the actual understanding is twofold. One, earlier in 2020, the manager hired me into that position. He was a really cool guy, great boss. He gets gently asked to quit. It's either quit or get fired. So he resigns and they put me into his role and mine. So I'm working day and night where I'm coming in. I typically would come in at, let's say 2. They had me coming in at 12 to manage day shift and manage night shift. And so I'm working both. I think I'm over 35 people. And I'm sitting there and I'm talking to the executives and they're telling me like over the entire region, they're saying, hey, speaking to your boss and seeing the analytics and how you're doing, you are next up. We've already discussed it. Once that role officially opens up, which there's this like separation period, after the role officially opens up, you're going to step right in. It's going to be close to $100,000 a year. So this was my dream. This is the thing I've been working for 5 years. And I was so excited. I'm sitting there and I'm doing 6 days a week sometimes just to make sure everything's good. And I remember walking in one day, and the way that the facility was set up is I had to walk in, I had to walk past the office of my former boss to get to my office and to get into the building. So as I'm walking in, I walk past this door, which was, there's never anyone in there. I'm the one in that office running both, and my office is right next to it. And as I'm walking past, this guy says, "Hey, who are you? It's nice to meet you." And I would look over, and there's somebody sitting in that chair at the desk. And I go, "Who are you?" Because that was supposed to be mine.
Yeah.
And he goes, "Oh, I'm the new whatever." And I go, "You're the new what?" He said, "Oh, I'm the new, basically, I'm your boss." And so I said, "Give me a minute." I didn't even tell him my name. I said, "Hold on." And I
Yeah.
went straight to the facility manager and I said, "You told me this was my job. I heard from the higher ups, even from the VP of this region, that this was mine. What happened?" And he said, "Well, this guy, he's got 33 years of experience. He's going to be a great asset to the company." And I went, the job never even opened. I didn't even get to put in an application. I said, "What happened?" And come to find out, this guy had been demoted from an executive into that role. And that was his last
Uh,
chance. He had been demoted 3 different times. So he had worked his way up into higher management, almost C-suite, and then got demoted, and then he got demoted again, and then he got demoted again, and then he was there. And and so when I started having anxiety attacks, this happened in April. So I started having anxiety attacks in May because the summer is the busiest time because I was working at Pepsi. That's the busiest time of the drink industry is in the summer. So I don't see a way out. I'm in this position where the business that we had on Amazon is not doing that. It's not doing that great. It's okay, but it's not enough for me to quit. And I don't want to keep doing this because the new boss I have sucks. And I don't want to spend another summer working 16 plus hours in the heat. I just don't want to do it. So because I didn't see a way out, I hated the boss I had. I started having these really bad anxiety attacks to the point where I came into work one day. I go to my boss and I tell him, I was like, "Dude, I'm having an anxiety attack right now. I can't do responsibilities." And he's like, "Oh, just suck it up and power through it." I went to the boss above him, and I get to the point where I'm sitting there, my chest is tight, I can't breathe. I start to cry. It's like, "Dude, that's what I'm dealing with right now." And he said, "Hey man, it's gonna be okay. We're gonna get through this together." It's like that doesn't help. If I'm experiencing this right now, me being there because they leave at 5 o'clock. They have a set schedule. I didn't. Mine was whenever the work got done. And I said, "You're in my mind, it's like you're telling me that it's gonna be okay, but you're not gonna be here all night. You're not gonna miss your son's basketball game. You're not gonna miss family activities to be here for people that don't care about me." And that moment, I remember so well that was one of those moments that flipped the switch for me where I said, "There's gotta be more to this." It's like I would
yeah.
rather go out on a limb, put it all out there and try to build a business than to be stuck here. I'd rather lose everything and I'd rather lose everything trying than to have everything and hate it. So lo and behold, I felt it was in June. I was in the mechanic shop one night and I felt strongly led that my time there was done. And so I went and that night I typed out my resignation letter, signed it, had it in my desk, called a friend over the weekend because I was working 6 days. And I called him and I said, "Hey, I feel I'm led to quit my job." And he said, "If you feel that way," he'd been in business for a decade. He said, "If you feel led that way, why are you even calling me?" And I said, "Okay." And so
Fair
I went
point.
in that Monday. Went in that Monday. I handed the resignation letter to this boss that I hated. And he said, "Are you serious?" And I said, "I am dead serious." My heart beating out of my chest. One of the scariest things I'd done. And because it was my whole life. Like that was the thing that pulled me out of a basement. That's how I was taking care of my family. It was everything.
Yeah.
And I was one of the youngest managers at Pepsi. I didn't have any connections. It wasn't like I had college that helped me get there. And I was up to get a promotion, a big one. So when I told him that, is he went, "Oh, okay. Can you give me a few extra weeks?" And I said, "No." He said, "Please just stay until." Nah. He's like, "I'm done. After these 2 weeks, I'm out." But and then my last day was June 26th of 2020. But that moment, like those moments was what led me to just think there's got to be more. And that's what led us into what most people hear with the story of going into Amazon, Amazon shutting down, everything like that. And we can get into that in a little bit. But if it hadn't have been for that integral moment of just feeling like there was no way out, that was when I found my way out. Because if everything had been good, I may still be working that job. We may never be having this conversation because I would have been comfortable.
Yeah.
I would have had everything that I had longed for. I would have had the definition of success that my parents had told me from a very young age. What would have stirred me to be more?
Yeah. Yeah. And that's one of the things that, just as you were saying that, that came to mind is like, this was the white collar job that your parents were just like, you got to have that, and so like you're literally at the precipice of like getting what you, I don't know how to say wanted, but felt like you were supposed to do.
Yep.
So like this was your self actualization, and you fucking miserable. So yeah, so it's like not only do you have the stress of your job and bills and everything else, but also it's just like you're in conflict with yourself, So that's got to be heavy. So you decide, it's like one of those moments like fuck you, fuck you, fuck you, you're cool, fuck you, I'm out. Like you just fucking you just left. What what was the game plan? Like I'm gonna dive into the wife's business,
Yep.
or
That
yeah.
was it.
So now you're working with your mom. So how is that? Because she's a control freak.
Hmm.
Uh, and she also was the one that was like, "You need to have a white collar job, make 100K a year," and then you're on the precipice of getting it. You're like, or you thought so at least, and then just, how did she react? First of all, when you found out that you didn't get the job, was she supportive or was she just like you failed?
So she's actually very supportive of that. I think a big reason for that is because she didn't know. but
Okay,
but when she did find out, she was very she understood because especially with how corporate America is, they're gonna put somebody in that position if they demote them down. It's easier for them to do that because they're basically sending them to their grave. And it makes
sure,
it easy for HR and legal to say, well, this is what the reason, the causation for letting them go was because we tried, they were at this level, they got demoted all the way down to this level. We tried time and time again to reform them, it didn't work. But there was so much that happened at that time because there was that job that it was mine. My name was on the chair, and actually it didn't amount to anything. It didn't actually actualize, I guess. And then there was another role that came up where my old boss, the one who got me on in Tennessee in Chattanooga, he was my first ever boss at Pepsi. Amazing guy, taught me how to be a really good boss. And he called me up after he had heard that I didn't get that job, and he said, "Hey, dude, there's the same role that you're in, but it's working with me and working under me. Is that something that you would want to do?" And I said, "Yeah, absolutely. I would love to." It was in Knoxville, Tennessee. And he said, "Okay, as soon as the job opens," he's like, "You got the role." Because I've already talked to them and they said, "Whoever you want to put in the role, you can put into the role." So I was like, "Oh, yeah, this is it." Now I'm about to flip the finger to this boss who I hate. And I'm about to be in a place where I know I'm going to be under a boss that I love. It's going to be incredible. Then I call him up a couple weeks later and I go, "Hey man, what's going on with this job?" And he said, "Well, the higher ups, they found this guy. He was already a part of the team, but he had been working this one role for 16 years. So they wanted to give him a shot in that role." And I went, "Are you serious?" It's like, "You told me that that was going to be my position." It's like, how do they pick somebody who's a lower level than I am? I have
yeah,
more experience than them in the role. How do they pick somebody like that? It's like, "Well, they're in house, so that's why they." And I went, "Dude, are you serious right now?" So then there was that. So I took another fat L, around the same time. And then because he had just transitioned into that job a couple months earlier, the person who was in his original job where I had started in Chattanooga, Tennessee, they were getting let go. So because they had just done terrible. And so he said, "Hey, that may be a great opportunity for you." And I went, "Okay, great. Because this is like a full circle thing." Cause I remember when I first was in the job, I looked at his office and I said, "That's going to be my office one day." And so I put in for the job, and the way that they had gotten him into the role is they had actually misstructured the the company in that like that facility. So this is going to make no sense to no one except for me and anyone who works at Pepsi. But there are certain levels that you are. So when you start a role, you're like a level one. And as you get higher up in the company, you become a higher level, almost like you're a video game character. Now that I think about it. So I was a level 6, and the role that the guy got demoted into was a level 10. And so obviously that's a
Yeah.
big pay raise.
Yeah.
And that was where I was supposed to be. So for me, the other one in Knoxville would have been level 6. In Chattanooga, they had mislabeled it and made it like a level 4. So I would have had to taken a pay cut to get there, and I would have had to move myself instead of,
Yeah.
if I moved up, they pay for you to move, they pay for relocation, everything. So when I'm sitting there and with the I'm debating with HR, and I'm saying, dude, I'm best friends. I'm really close friends with my old boss who had this position. He was a level 6. I said, why would you make this a level 4 and try to take 20 grand from me to come and take a bigger facility? Like, this facility is almost twice the size. I make more money here. Why would I go do more for a whole lot less?
Yeah.
And so there was that back and forth. And then the HR got upset at me. It's like, you should never applied if you would have. It's like, no, you guys should have just structured it correctly. But okay.
Yeah. So you're just like, fuck this shit.
L.
I'm out. Yeah.
Yeah.
So when you made that transition to like, you know, being like, all right, we're gonna have this family business. Let's put some jet fuel on it. What was that like? I mean, you're working with your wife, and then you're also working with your mom. So what was there? How was that? Like, was there an adjustment period, or did you guys just kind of get along? I gotta imagine everything that I know about your mom so far. That was probably quite an adjustment period.
Well, it was very interesting because we lived in East Texas at this time. So she was still in Tennessee. So
Gotcha.
there was not that one to one. We didn't see each other every day. And the only time that we would talk is if there was a Zoom meeting. So we were doing Zoom meetings before they were cool. But the with my wife and I, the thing that I find most interesting when I look back on that time was my neither my mom nor my wife truly had an understanding of business structure and what to do if you have somebody come into the business with the right knowledge. So what I mean by that is, let's say that I was running a successful company and I needed somebody to help me with marketing. And I knew that you had sold an agency, but I bring you on and I make you the janitor. That would be stupid. Like, there's a palpable need in my company that I know that you can meet, but I make you the janitor. And that's basically what happened. So I came home with the skill sets to help them structure their team because they already had a team, helping them structure a team, helping them actually tighten up the supply chain, helping them basically not necessarily make more money, but save more money. I was going to help them with the bottom line, but they stuck me in this new division, which was they're like, okay, we're going to try to explore doing this with Amazon. So what does that mean for me? It's like, well, just go watch all these videos in the course. So, but that makes no sense. You already have an existing thing that's making money. If you put me in there, we would go further faster. It's like, no, just do this. So I went, okay. And so for 2 weeks after I quit, I just watched videos and cold outreach to wholesale suppliers. But that never really equivalated to anything because for most people, if you know or if you don't know, wholesale, to get those really good relationships, typically you start with super tight margins because they just want to see, can you sell it? And they want to see how much volume are you going to do? Because if you're doing a ton of volume at those slim margins, they're going to be willing to widen the margin. But that didn't help us. We had this extra stressor of we needed to go further faster, and why am I over here? And then 2 months later, when Amazon actually shut us down, that was where we can sit there and talk about with my mom. Is so she calls us up because Amazon shuts us down. They're holding 58K, and she's like, "What happened?" And we have to sit there and tell her that we had gotten a wholesale lot from this supplier that had the paperwork, but it wasn't the correct paperwork. And we didn't know that because we didn't know enough about wholesale to be able to vet suppliers. So we got this inventory in, sent it into Amazon so they could do fulfilled by Amazon. And when we did, of course, it gets checked and we're not allowed to sell that thing. So we get shut down. And she just unloads. I can't believe that's so stupid. Why wouldn't you vet them? And it's like, A, looking back, you didn't know how to vet them either. but you were going to berate us, which in the moment made sense because she was the main investor. That was basically her role. Was she, because she had worked so long in her job with the post office, she had incredible credit. And so what that equal to was really good credit cards. So that way we could sit there and have business funding without going and getting business funding. And from her investor standpoint, she was just letting us have it, even though this was not my business. Like I was actually in their business and supporting their business. So the fact that she was out of it for no reason was one of the determining factors of what happened because she didn't have eyes on. But I digress. So that was that dichotomy where with my wife, she was all into the thing that was making money. I'm over here in front of the same setup I have right now, and I'm just sitting there watching videos all day, every day, half asleep. Sometimes I'd get my controller from the other room and plug it into the computer and sit there and play Call of Duty while I'm supposed to be doing stuff in the business. Because for those that don't realize, when you're in a job for so long, there's actually a transitional phase where if you go from reporting to someone every day, you're there a certain amount of time every day, you expect a paycheck at the same day every single week or every other week. It's very difficult to go from structured to unstructured, where now you're the boss. Now you have to construct your time. You have to be the end all be all. So I had that transitional phase in the midst of also being in kind of the wrong spot. So yeah.
So, so much to dive into. Let's take one more quick break. You've told your whole pivot story like many times.
Mhm.
The thing that I find the most interesting, um, to me from the outside, is like the how you had like you in one episode that I listened to, like you talked about your faith.
Mhm.
And you talked about how like you felt like, God is telling you, like guiding you and telling you like you need to do this thing. And that's like so very different how I interface from the world. And so there's a lot there I'd love to get into, but at what point you're doing this, things are not working, you're like, 50K in debt, you have all this inventory in your fucking garage or whatever. At what point, obviously you're just like, I gotta do something, like I gotta do fucking something. Um, but at what point does that voice start coming to you? Did you make the I mean, again, clearly, like, something has to be done, so there is that self-preservation, but at what point did you start that process of being like, "I gotta do something," to at what point did that guiding voice come in for you?
So great question. The the big thing that, because even as you've heard, the way that I explain that story is different depending on where I'm at.
Sure,
So depending on what kind of podcast I'm on, because one is when I sit there and I say, "Hey, I felt the Lord tell me to quit." That there's going to be a variety of people that immediately turn off because they're going to be like, "Oh, it's not for me. I don't
sure,
believe that."
yeah,
So cool. I'll just make it more existential. But if I sit there and I actually dive into that guiding voice for me, for the people who do sit there and believe that God is real, and that a lot of times I've seen it because I grew up in the South. I grew up in the Bible Belt, so I grew up seeing church, going to church, but I didn't ever really see anyone who was like the people that I read about in the Bible, where
mm,
they were actually hearing from God. They actually would communicate. Because the big misconception that I've seen is that, especially from people in the actual Christian faith, is that God is a separate, he's higher than, you cannot access him. But even if you look in the Old Testament, when he actually was separate, it still would say that his spirit came powerfully upon this person and they spoke. So why is it that when I'm growing up and I see all these people in church, there ain't nobody talking, like there's definitely no higher presence hitting them.
yeah, yeah,
And so as I sit there and I'm in now in this place when we're talking about with Amazon shutting us down, I had this crazy belief, the same way I had the crazy belief that I had been spoken to quit the job. I had this crazy belief that, oh, just a moment, Amazon's going to come back. I just had the faith for it. And it didn't. Every single day I woke up and my wife would be asking me, what's the game plan? What are we doing? And I would say, oh, we're good. The Amazon's going to come back a couple days. We're going to get that 50K influx. It's going to be great. It didn't. Like, it took 8 months. We didn't have 8 months to wait. 8 months is how long it took. We got it back,
Wow.
I think, in May of 2021. So think about that. A year to the date that I had made that I started having anxiety attacks was when the money actually comes back. And by then we're doing $100,000 a month in in that business. So the biggest shift was, thankfully, there's two of us in it, and that was my wife was not so content with just sitting and waiting. So she started exploring every single option possible, and I worked with her in this. Is she started exploring liquidation because we had $50,000 worth of inventory sitting in our garage, and so we started looking at liquidation, but was something that we would buy for, let's say, $20, and we could sit there and mark up and flip for 40 plus. Somebody be willing to take it on the liquidation for like a dollar. So that so if you're $58,000 in debt and you take everything at a dollar to $2 or less, even some things were just pennies on the dollar, you were going to be super upside down.
Yeah.
And so that wasn't going to work. Then we were looking at other business models, and we just thought, but we don't have any available, we don't have anything available to do it. So we already have all this inventory. What are we going to do? And we tried that. Liquidation was a big one. We tried like trying to figure out different wholesale lots, turning them into wholesale lots. Like that's a memory that I haven't thought about in a long time. Was we actually tried to take what we had and turn it into wholesale lots, and people buy them as wholesale lots, and that didn't work very well. We had some when you're 58,000 and B you have every single month bills. There was never It was not going to be enough. We had just started doing drop shipping and
Yeah.
with the inventory we had in the garage, and most people have a very innate understanding that no matter what business model you're in, if it is drop shipping, it still takes some time. It takes some time for it to build up. But again, because we're in this
Yeah.
beautiful space where we had the skill sets for, especially my wife, she had already done e-commerce for 2 years at this point. We were able to list it in a way that no one else was. We didn't do the white backgrounds. With Facebook, it's much more personal. So we made it something that most people don't know. So if you guys are doing Facebook Marketplace, this is a good tip, is we made the backgrounds customer photos because that's real. They can see how a product actually is. They could see what it looked like, fully assembled, whatever it was, and we would use those. And the first month, we made enough money to pay the bills. By the end of 2020, we made enough to help up. I think it was 33 underprivileged kids have Christmas, which was cool. And then within 6 months, we were making $100,000 a month in top line sales, which we were still netting and then bringing home about 20K. So that was more than I was making in 2 months. That was more than I was making an entire year working at corporate. And by the end of 2021, we had made 1 million. And so that
Yeah.
that was one of those instances, especially we're talking about guiding voice, where I just don't think we would have ever found that. Because now granted, if you want to sit there and just think about it in the practical sense, we were looking everywhere, but we'd also tried everything. And this was another one of those experiences where we just said, we felt led to it and just said, hey, we'll try it. And we tried it and it turned out beautifully for us. Now, granted, somebody else, we've seen other people have the same opportunity, get into that opportunity and it do nothing for them. So why are we different than everyone else? There was skill sets already pre-built. So there is that practical sense that I want people to understand, is that it can be a great opportunity for somebody. Like I could be under your tutelage about marketing, but if I don't have the skill
Um,
sets to market, I'm going to get into an opportunity and crush. But with us during that time, there was a moment where we just knew there's nothing we could do. Like everything that we had tried to do, it wasn't working. So I remember my wife had taken my son and they went to Mississippi for his birthday, and they had met up in Mississippi and they were hanging out. They went, I don't remember. I think they were right outside of Biloxi, and they were at the beach. And so for me, I'm sitting there in this home. We are a few weeks away from basically losing it all again. And I'm just on my knees, just crying out. Like, hey, I felt I didn't want to quit my job. For me, I felt like the Lord told me to. So I'm sitting there arguing with God and I'm saying, you told me to quit. I didn't want to quit. Like I was making plenty enough money. Yeah, I hated it, but I wouldn't have been in this situation. So I said, if that is you, if you had told me to do this thing, then you got to make something work because I can't tried it, but it's on you now. I said, if you tell me to do it, you got to provide for us through it. And when my wife came home, so I think it was like a week later, maybe less than a week, she's on Facebook because we basically just gave up at this point. We'd have our daily be in the corner crying, depression sessions, and we'd go on. But she one day was just on Facebook and she's scrolling Facebook and she comes across this video from somebody that was in a whole different space than what we're in. They're in Amazon, but they do private label. And they had made a video about how Facebook was rolling out some new features and to just keep an eye on it because it could be really good for e-commerce. And then as she's scrolling Facebook again, she goes to Facebook Marketplace and just sees how a product is posted. And it's posted identical to how you would post it on Amazon with a white background, very much a square. And so she sees that and she goes, Steven, I'm pretty sure that this is drop shipping the same way we did it on Amazon. Do you want to just try it? And I said, what we got to lose? So we did. And what we did, that like this is where our skill sets met opportunity because they had just released shipping. This is around the time that shipping became a thing on Facebook Marketplace. So we get on there, we take our inventory, put it up on there. That starts making sales.
Hold on. Says your browser is preventing recording. Ew. Right. We've been having problems with Riverside. I love Riverside.fm, but this is like the third time now we've had recording issues. I know they're like launching a new version soon, so I don't know if it has something to do with that. So anyway, things might be jumpy. I'm gonna try and fix this in post, but if things are a little weird, that's why. So anyway, yeah, you got to essentially like so you've now you've been doing the Facebook. You've basically been like finding success on it, but there are other people that at the time like tried the same thing, but it just didn't really work for them. But so
Yep.
like for you, a lot of that seems to be like this guiding principle, this guiding kind of direction. Like my main thing is like, people say like the Lord told me or God led me to this or whatever, but I'm I'm not saying that that's wrong. And I'm not saying that it's incorrect, but for me, like I've never experienced that.
Mhm.
I don't know what that is. And I always try and think because there's a lot of people that say shit like that, and I think they're full of shit. I think they're
Yeah.
grifters. I'm sure you've experienced a lot of that in churches and stuff. They're people that are just saying shit. And I think even if you're the most religious person available, you'll think a lot of people are just full of shit. You know,
Mhm.
I think some people do it and they delude themselves and they think it. But there are people like yourself who I think are very much so grounded in reality and are over. But for me, like I've never experienced. I've had these moments where, for example, when I was at that in Michigan on the lake and having that moment where I'm like, I need to fuck. I was at a very similar kind of pivot point, like you were, and I was just like, I am not happy with my life. I'm not really doing very well. My mental health and my physical health are terrible. I had an ulcer. I was losing my fucking mind. I was stressed out. My work, to be frank, just started slipping. I was making mistakes with clients. I just wasn't there. I wasn't doing well. I wanted to do well, but I just didn't have it in me. I was just really falling apart. Um, and I think the big thing is just like my heart wasn't in it anymore. And
Mhm.
that was a self-reinforcing feedback loop, because then you start not doing as good a work and then that demoralizes you further because again, just like with you, a lot of my self-worth is tied to doing a really good job and overachieving. So if I'm failing, then that makes it even worse. So I've had all these things. And when I'm there and I'm in Lake Michigan and I'm having these thoughts, like I do feel this pull to certain directions and things, but I don't personify that as like, God's voice. To me,
Right.
that's just like me sitting there writing it down and being like, okay, that this feels right or this gives me energy. Like, to me, like I think about it in terms of like, okay, do I see myself I have 12 months left to live. Do I see myself like wanting to still be doing this? The answer is no. And I'm like, okay, do I see myself still wanting to be in Dayton, Ohio? No. Like, what do I want to be doing? Like, and asking me all these questions, and I am having like this intuitive thought and a guide, like a pool, but it's just me asking myself questions. So my question to you is like, how do you distinguish between like God and what is just you, like your
Hmm.
intuition or your hunch or whatever? Because I've never really heard that. I'm sure people have talked about it, but I've never heard that like clarified at all. It's almost like when I hear people talk about, God told me this or spoke to me this, it's almost like it's without, it's just
Reason.
assumed.
Mhm.
Yeah, like people are, do you know how to speak a language that I don't? Because like to me, like it's like you're speaking, Chinese, or you speaking Mandarin, or you speaking
Yeah.
Japanese. Like I just, that doesn't register to me. So like, how would you distinguish like those two things? Because I'm really curious.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a great question. How do you distinguish what you believe to be God's voice from indigestion? Let's say maybe you had some bad tacos.
Yeah,
Is when I when I think of it, especially in that sense, it just reminds me of earlier when we were talking about the love languages.
yeah,
Is if I was beamed up, let's say the aliens exist, and they drop me off in China, and I've got to make it work. Because right now all I got is my cell phone, and let's say that they took that too, is I would not understand them. And I would just hope that maybe there's somebody that understands me. But let's say I'm way out in the rural country, they are not going to speak English out there. But I've still got to live. Is if I work at it enough, I will be able to figure out that what they're saying to me equals that they're trying to give me food, or they're telling me to watch out for that tiger that's hiding in the bushes. Eventually, if I actively work at learning that language, same thing with the love languages, right? And that's what I feel when it comes to hearing God's voice, if you equivalate it to such, is for me, is it's just been something I've worked at. I think that for people who believe and for people who don't believe, there's still this innate longing that we have this hunch that there's more to us than just our physical. I mean, we had a conversation a while ago where you talked about being in New Orleans. New Orleans is the voodoo headquarters of the world. And when you sit there and you think about that, what basis does voodoo actually stand on? They stand on that there is something outside of ourselves that we can tap into. That's where you
sure,
see the push pin dolls and all the stuff you see in horror movies. But there's more there. We sit there and we don't have a full understanding of who we are, not even as on a personal level, but who we are even in the earthly perspective. Like there's a very interesting theory that's called the stone tape theory. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of it, but
yeah,
the stone
yeah,
tape theory is something where like stones can sit there and record memory. And when you sit there and you think about that, it's like, wait, that doesn't logically to me, that makes no sense. Like, how could a rock near some water record a memory? And maybe that's where you'll sit there and you'll see a ghost hunter show or something where there'll be the same footsteps every single night at the same time because it's on a recording, but it's not on a recording that we understand. Like a rock can actually play back music if it's done a certain way. So my my whole reason of saying all that is I look at it more than just a religious belief. I grew up in church, and a lot of people just believe that if you read the Bible, you're in church, God's going to speak to you. I look at it on a full scale of if there is, like, if I just happen to believe that there is a spiritual realm, that there is something where I walk into a room and it just feels a little darker than another space, or I walk into a room and I'm happy there, but there's nothing different about that space than the dark space. That must mean that there's something I don't understand, even if that's electromagnetic forces, which a lot of people like to say. If that's true, why is it different? Why is there more electromagnetic energy happening in one area than another? Why is this space helping or impacting me to have darker thoughts or lighter thoughts? And for me, is I've bought in same way I bought in with my wife. I bought in that God is real to me. So I just actively try to just if there is a higher being out there, I just want to see if he's real, will he speak to me? And if he's speaking to me, what does it sound like? And if it sounds this way, let me just try it. Like if he's telling me to quit the job, I'll try it. And it wasn't that first experience. There was littler things where it'd be, hey, just go all out, just go full out with your wife. There was these little experiences, and it wasn't like I was somebody who I was all in church and God every Sunday and on Wednesday and sometimes Tuesday nights. It was I actually hated church. I didn't go to church. Only thing I knew how to kind of do in the religious space was what I felt was talk to God. And the only way I did that was on my way to work every day. I would believe that he was in the passenger seat with me, and I would just unload on my good and my bad. And he was that father figure I didn't have. And even if we get into the existential look at it of, well, maybe he doesn't, maybe he's not real, But if he's real enough to me that it stirs me to be a better person, if he's real enough to me that it stirs me to believe that I have a father that truly cares about every aspect of me, it helps me to be a better person. It actually helps me be better in business. What does it hurt? Right. So when I sit there and I lean into this voice, I talk to the wind, let's say, but I feel I get a response, then it's for me to sit there and say, okay, if the wind's responding to me, let me go see if what the wind says makes any sense. And I just try it. And I've seen it work. I've seen blessings come from my life and things happen in my life from a being that I can't see actually imparting in me. Maybe it's a pull in a certain direction. Maybe it's just my conscience, right? But every single one of those things, I just lean into it, especially if it's for my betterment. If it's something where, even as you were saying, sitting on the dock in Lake Michigan, if you just you felt pulled that this is where I'm supposed to be the rest of my life. Like there's something more to life than just having money or having what the world would think is success. There's more to it.
Yeah.
And leaning into it and just saying, you know, it, it doesn't make a lot of sense, but I'll give it a try. And that's the same way that I've experienced the Holy Spirit, God, the universe, however people put it. For me, it's God. Is actually sitting on docks, being near bodies of water. That's where I've experienced him the most because that's to me, if the spirit realm is real, that's where the veil between the two is the thinnest. That's where I feel the most connection and the most opportunity to have a voice from the other side, as most people call it, speak into me. And it may not be an audible voice that I hear and say, okay, you just spoke to me and told me to take a left instead of a right. It may be just this weird innate feeling that I'm supposed to try this instead of doing what I'm already doing. Does that kind of answer it? Like I just kind of gave this big look.
It kind of does. I'm still trying to piece some things together. One thing that you said, the stoned ape theory. That's I'm curious what the stoned memory thing is. The stoned ape is basically, I think it's Derek and Dennis and Terrence McKenna. But talk about the theory is that like basically more or less took psilocybin like magic mushrooms, and that's like what influenced like the evolutionary curve. So basically, uh, but yeah, so I'm kind of curious about the whole stones having memory thing. I've heard people talk about like
Mhm.
water having memory, and it's always been kind of a fascinating thing. But um, yeah, I still don't know what the distinction between that like people feeling like they're getting guidance from God versus intuition.
Mhm.
Like to me, I don't really see a difference, and it's interesting to see some people like for you. It seems like it's something that you believe, but you're perhaps a little more loose, where it's just like it works for you, and you choose to believe it, which I suppose is what faith really is. There's other people that I've talked to where it's like a fact to them, and like that's kind of, I don't know, that's where I start to get, it starts to get like kind of difficult for me to bridge that gap, because it's like I heard in one of the episodes that I listened to with you where you talked about obedience,
Yep.
like, and this surrender, and I find that so interesting with when it comes to people of faith. A lot of the time there's this surrender, there's this submission, there's this obedience, and it's like a letting go of responsibility. And for me, like, again, it goes back to that whole like perfectionism, overworking, whatever, control. I have to have control in every aspect of my life, which is why I'm an entrepreneur. And if so, the thought of not having that and giving that to something is like horrifying to me. But you have a very similar trajectory that I did, but it went in the opposite direction, where perhaps like obedience and surrender is um, it is cathartic for you. Like it is a release to not have to have them. So I'm like, I don't know. I'm really just kind of curious, having that all that context of your life is. I'm curious. Were your parents religious at all?
My parents were the ones who put me in church, but they
Okay.
never. So, I mean, again, grew up in the South, grew up in the Bible Belt. So I went to church from a very young age, but I never saw it. Like to me, honestly, their walk was so much different that I would watch them go to church and then get in the car immediately after and just argue the whole time.
Wow.
And it it equivalated to me not necessarily believing that there was a God. I was like, if this God is supposed to be a God that loves us and cares for us, why are bad things happen? If he loves for us and cares for us, why do my parents always fight? Like every single time we go to church, they argue. And it seems like they don't care for one another. So why would I believe that there is God that created me that cares for me?
Yeah.
And that was one of those things where I just, even growing up, I still just held on to this belief that it like you said, I was kind of loose with it. I didn't go to church, but I'd still, it was easier for me on a logical sense to believe that there was some bigger, higher power that constructed us than a explosion millions of years ago, and we just magically came together in such a way that everything works in tandem. That just doesn't logically make a lot of sense. That there was a huge explosion, because I haven't seen it happen in the last few thousand years. There's been plenty of explosions where things have exploded, but they didn't come together. They actually disintegrated. So my look at that is, okay, it makes more sense to me that there is a higher being that constructed us. And if that is the case, then maybe I can't find him in a church that doesn't actually look to that. They just look to a book. Because if we're honest, and if there's anyone that's of the same belief that I have, I'm about to offend every single thing you got. But the Bible is just a book. Now, if we're of the same faith, you believe that God inspired it. But if you don't believe it, you can read it and get nothing from it. Why
Sure.
is that? Because it's just ink on paper and leather that binds it. It's the belief system behind it and the actual longing to know the bigger creator over just the book that gives the book meaning. And even when we sit there, like for me, that longing to see, okay, and to learn more about if there is a higher being out there, just trying to figure out who are they? What are they? At a certain point in my life, I was like, are they aliens? It's like, okay, what does that look
Yeah.
like?
Yeah.
And then I just thought, well, if there's aliens and there's a bunch of them, who created them? It's like the chicken before the egg kind of thing. It's like, where did the first one come from? And then it just always led me back to, there's got to be something that stands almost like, I don't know if you watch any Marvel movies, but you have in Marvel, there's this guy called the Seer, and he stands between every reality and he can see everything. And so when I think of that, I think there's got to be someone or something similar to that that can see every single reality, every single dimension, if there's multiple of them, and was able to make things occur. Because even we see it with the Watcher was only supposed to watch, but if he interceded or he got into the middle of a moment, he could change the entire trajectory. And I was just thinking, if there's someone out there like that, what do they look like? Who are they? What do they do? Do they just watch all day? And so I just kind of started exploring that path. And the more I explored that path, the same way that you have people that will explore voodoo or Hinduism or Buddhism, whatever it may be, they get closer to whatever they believe the creator to be. For me, the reason why I believe in God and not Buddha or the hundreds of Hindu gods that they have is because Christianity is the only one that has a God that is still alive. Like most of these other gods have died at some point. And when I sit there and I think someone died, came back, and then went to this ethereal plane, is interests me to say what gave them power to do such. And what and their calling, according to this book, is that they loved me enough that they died and did that. And they were actually sent from the overwhelming creator. So what if they had a voice, what does their voice sound like? Does it sound like my conscience? And and again, and like you said, it's like, well, it doesn't, the indistinguishable. There's been times that I've felt like I've heard audible words. And I think it's just from flexing the muscle of exploring that pathway of who is this person? Who is this being? And for me, if I believe that there's a higher creator, they're going to create me to do higher things. They're going to create me to do greater things. And because if we're talking about spiritual, like the stone tape theory, because I pulled it up on Wikipedia, it says not to be confused with the stone ape theory. The stone tape theory is the speculation
Oh,
that ghosts and
stone tape.
hauntings.
I thought you
Yeah,
said
stone
stoned
tape.
ape. Okay. I was like, I don't think that's the stoned ape theory.
Nope.
Stone tape. Okay.
Stone tape. So the stone tape theory is a speculation that ghosts and hauntings are analog there's a different word, but I don't know how to pronounce it, are analog to tape recordings. And that
Mm,
mental impressions during emotional or traumatic events can be projected in the form of energy recorded onto rocks and other items and replayed under certain circumstances. So when I sit there and I hear of the stone tape theory, is that if there is a traumatic moment that happens most of the time in a house, let's say that somebody gets murdered and that's a traumatic event where that moment is recorded in the stones. And that's why under the right conditions, there will be a replay of that exact moment, a cry, a scream, whatever it may be. And if that is the case, if you happen to say, well, there's some stuff I can't explain, then if that's a thing, if a stone tape theory is a thing that a rock can record a horrific moment, then that would mean that there is some kind of spiritual realm we don't understand. And that would mean that if there's some kind of spiritual realm, that this means that there's things we don't see that impact what we do see. And there's also things that we don't see that are there for some weird reason. So where did they come from? Why do they exist? And I think that this is, for me, this is when I've had conversations, I have plenty of conversations with people who don't believe the way I do. I love to get their insight because I want to understand what questions did you ask that led you there? Because for me, I just ask a ton of questions the same way I do in business. Like, does this make sense? Because asking so many questions is what led me here. Now, I've met people that they've asked the same questions and it led them somewhere else. And that's perfectly fine. I'm not here to say one way is right or wrong. I'm not here to Bible thump anyone that hears this. I'm just saying my conclusion is this because of all of the different experiences I've had in my own life and the different questions I've asked. Because growing up, again, as I talked about earlier, and as most of you have heard, I like my parents went to church sometimes, but it wasn't like it made a difference in their life. But my dad used to always watch ghost stuff. And he used to talk about how my uncle was like at one point in time trying to be a shaman. And then he one night late at night, he started running through the house, apparently possessed or whatever it may be, screaming out that the devil was trying to kill him and with a butcher's knife in his hand. So there's these weird experiences. And then as I'm watching ghost stuff, is it just had me ask questions. To me, I found it fascinating that there could be things that we don't see that they can have an impact on the physical. They can lock a door. They can cry out. They can tap on a wall. If that's the truth, which I won't know. To some people it's the truth, to some people it's not. In my own experience, going to my grandmother's house, even when I wasn't necessarily leaning into that voice, that guiding voice, there was plenty of experiences I had that built the belief system that ghosts are real, the spirit realm is real. One of them being my grandmother is elderly. And then I also have an uncle who was in his high 60s, I think early 70s. They were in the living room, and my cousin and I think we were 16. We were at my grandmother's house. We used to spend a lot of time there. And we told them, hey, we're going outside. It's late at night, probably 9, 10 o'clock. And we told them, hey, we're going outside. Don't lock us out. We're going to be on the back deck. So we go out on the back deck. They're in there. We're hanging out for 15 minutes or so. We go back in. Door's locked. So we go, we knock on the door. They let us in. So when we get let back in, about 15, 20 minutes later, we tell them, hey, we're going back outside. Don't lock us out. And they said, okay. We went back outside. We made sure the door wasn't locked. We're sitting there, we're talking. We try to go back in, door's locked again. We knock on the door, they let us back in. So we tell them a third time, we're going outside. Do not lock us out. This time we went through the rest of the house. There's 3 entrances, front door, back door, side door. We went and unlocked all of them. And we went out onto the back deck. And this time we took our chairs and faced them inwards. So as we're talking, we can see my grandmother and my uncle sitting in the living room. So 15 to 30 minutes later, when you know it, we go back inside. That back door is locked. Go to the front door is locked. Go to the side door is locked. We watched, we paid attention to the only other people that were there. They could not have locked it. Why were the doors locked? We checked all 3 of them multiple times to make sure they weren't before we went outside. So that experience was just one of many that I've had that let me know that this ain't adding up. Like, this math ain't mathing right. So if this is happening, why? Because most people won't happen to ask the question, why is it happening? And then
yeah.
secondly, is if this is something that is there that can do that can impact the physical realm, what what other beings could there be? And is there a being higher than this one that is locking the doors? And if so, who are they? What do they look like? What do they sound like? And that road, that path, and all the questions asked along the way is what's led me to the belief that God is real and that He speaks to me. And He speaks sometimes in an audible voice, very, very super ridiculously rare. Most of the time, if I'm very honest, it's more like a picture. The way that I see it is there'll be a time where I'll just be sitting there, not thinking about anything, or I'll talk to somebody and I'll just get a picture of this person 5 years down the road. I'll get a picture of this person with with some kind of thing that they've been hoping for but never said. And I'll share it with them and I'll say, "Hey, this is what I'm seeing right now. This is what I feel. Does that at all relate to you?" And they'll just sit there and say, "This is something I've prayed about for the last 5 years. I've been praying about this, seeking help for this for the however long amount of time." And the fact that you just said exactly what I've been hoping for lets me know that I'm seen. And that's again, if I'm completely honest with the people who believe and don't, in the moment that you sit there and you see this picture, you go, "Oh, I'm making that up." You can sit there and see it and be like, that's not going to relate to them," but you just feel an urgency to tell them. And when you tell them, typically, that's leaning into and just trying it. Is when I lean in and just try it, that's when they say, "Wow, that's the exact same thing that I was just praying for before I even came to church," or "That was the exact thing I was hoping for before I ran into you today." That's verbatim what I was saying. There's no way I would know that. And that's what leads me to the conclusion that there has to be a higher calling, a creator that can download into me a thought process that is exactly what somebody else was putting out into the spiritual realm.
Yeah, I think, I mean, first of all, as far as, you know, people having conflicting beliefs or whatever, it's like the whole point of this, at least if there's a point to my podcast, if there is any, it's to understand people and where they're coming from. Like, for example, you shared all your stories. Like, it doesn't really matter if I agree or disagree with your thought
Hmm.
process. Or not your thought process. Well, I guess your thought process, but also your conclusions. But I want to know context. I want to know all of that because it's so easy to look at somebody who, is a Republican or a conservative or a libertarian, an anarchist, or insert to whatever, and then you have religion. You have got all these different factions and basically sports teams that we all like to
Yeah.
put, and it's easy just to judge, but it's like, what got you to that point?
Hmm.
And, for me, it's like, I don't, I think it comes down to also the concept of free will, which I'm really curious to get your process on because I feel like that goes along and also is in direct conflict with various faiths. But, I don't believe in free will, really, which is weird because I also believe that kind of in a lot of ways you're God of your own world. And if you want to change something, you have to take ownership and you have to do it. So that's really kind of an interesting thing. But, ultimately, there is a lot of things that we don't quite understand. And I feel like eventually we will, but we just don't have the tools or the awareness to see it. Like, I mean, I've talked about this a couple times in the podcast, but it's like, you know, dolphins and whales communicate in a way that we can't perceive.
Yep.
Bees and bats, they interface with the world in a way that we cannot perceive. My dog can hear things that I cannot, they're completely inaudible to me. Um, and and sense of smell, like my dog Hamilton, when we're out, there's a whole language and a whole way of what he's smelling. Clearly, is giving him a lot of data that like I just cannot perceive. So there's all of these things that are like these subterranean layers of reality that we're just not tapped into, that clearly are there to some extent, but they are completely invisible to us. So when you're hearing of these things like ghosts and all this other stuff, it's like I think a lot of people kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater. And even though I am like a very pretty, I don't want to say rigid, but I am very much so a science based person. Science is a constant evolution of testing hypotheses and gathering data and whatever. And I think a lot of people that take this militant atheist view are also like just as much like zealots as the religious folks that are on the extreme side of the religion that are just as dogmatic. And so like for me, I'm always open minded, and that's why I love hearing perspectives like yours that I don't rather than judging, it's like I want to try and understand where you're coming from because clearly like if I went through life in the same way that you did, I probably would come to the same conclusions, you know? So I'm always looking to understand that. Where I get really suspicious is when people say that they know. And like that's what really like my spidey sense goes off, because it's just like we don't we don't know. Like I like that's where like I respect people that said they have faith, because you're not saying that you know definitively. You're saying I have faith in this. My intuition's telling me this. This is something that I believe in, and I think that's fucking fine. You are entitled to your faith. But when people, again, regardless if it's militant atheism or like the most religious, extreme person, both sides of that still claim to know factually something, and that makes me really uncomfortable. Because I feel like that misguides everything. So, um, yeah, I don't know.
Because
For me, go on.
you sit there and you think of, even from my perspective, this is somebody invited me to a Bible study, right? Cool, makes sense for my faith. And they
Yeah,
asked me a really simple question, and this is what I would ask anyone who's on the religious extreme. Is he asked, "Where is God?" That seems like a pretty straightforward question, right? Where is he? If he exists, where is he? And if you sit there and you think about it, if he is a higher being, if he stands outside of time, then he can't be in a void, because if he created everything, what was the void? Like, where is the void?
yeah,
It can't be a void. He would have had to created it. So where was he before the void? And then you're stuck in this cycle of, if you can't answer that question definitively and show me without a shadow of a doubt, this is exactly where God is. He is right here in this spot. Here's the latitude, longitude. Then you have to be open minded, and that's a there are some people that are a part of the same faith that I'm gonna offend with that, which is fine, because it's not. And the reason why I'm okay with that is you have to be open minded to the fact that there's people that you're going to interact with that are not going to have the same belief. And if you
yeah,
come hard and fast with saying this is the truth, period, then I see it all the time. You may have experienced too. I experience it quite often being in the South. Was there would be this person at big events that they would stand out there with a megaphone and say, "You're going to hell. You're going to hell." Like we had two Airbnbs in Nashville. They were 5 minutes from Bridgestone Arena, which was the main place where the main event center, and downtown. And one time we were spending some time in our Airbnb, and so we wanted to go downtown. So my wife and I were walking downtown, and apparently there was like a Billie Eilish concert that was going on. Cool. Like, I think that's cool. There's big celebrities in town. And there was a line of people that were lined up to go in. And this person was standing on the street giving them 8,000 reasons why they're going to hell. And I'm just thinking, if God is real, that is definitely the worst way to get to try to convince them, is to
yeah,
sit there and say, "Hey, because of your life choices, you absolutely suck, and you're going straight to in misery for forever and ever." I'm pretty sure even if I'm standing on the other side and you're telling me I'm going to hell, even though I believe in God, I'm gonna sit there and be like, "You suck." That
yeah,
there's no way I'm gonna believe in something that you believe in, because you're just bashing me without knowing me. Same thing, even if we talked about earlier, where it's like, wait, you're trying to you're trying to do business with me, but you don't even know me. Like,
yeah,
you don't know me at all. And that's one of those things where this person's coming hard and fast saying, because you are listening to Billie Eilish music and dressed in all black, you're going to hell. It's like, what if there's Christian who just enjoys Billie Eilish music that's standing in the
yeah.
line,
Billie
and you're
Eilish
accusing them to go
seems
into hell?
they seem pretty wholesome to me, all things considered. Like I've never seen anything Billie. I mean, maybe I'm just not aware, but I haven't seen anything Billie Eilish that screams. It's not like she's Marilyn Manson, Like it's just like
Yeah.
I don't get it, but
And that's actually a very interesting topic as well. Is if we talk about God, if God exists, then there must be a devil. And the thing, Marilyn Manson said it himself. He said that early in his career, and for those of you listening, I could be wildly misquoting this, so please fact check me. If I'm wrong, let me know, because I would love to, because I've been holding on to this quote for a long time. Is Marilyn Manson talked about early in his career that he used to worship Satan, and then he said that he was telling the devil to show up, and he said one day the devil showed up in his bedroom, and that scared him so much that he renounced it. And and we hear that terminology. We've used that term before. It's like, speak of the devil, and we hear that, but we don't actually have any context to it. It's like, even with the movie Ghost Rider, you sit there and he calls out, he speaks of the devil, and the devil shows up and says, "Hey, I'll keep you alive if you do this." And so we hear that terminology, to speak of the devil. We say that flippantly, but what does that mean? Even Jeffrey Dahmer, I believe there's been multiple serial killers that have said that the devil told me to do it. Why? Like, why would they even say that? Like, they don't believe in God. They would say God doesn't exist, but they would say that the devil told them to do it. The devil told them to kill these people. The, I forget what his name is. Richard Martinez, I think, was another serial killer, and he was very well known in California for killing a bunch of people. And when he was on trial, he had a pentagram dug into his hand, and he would just hold it up. He wouldn't say anything. And then in some of his letters or in his paintings, he would depict the devil. So was that just a moral representation of who he is? That he believes that he is the devil. But if that's the truth, then who is the devil? Why does this person who is doing evil believe that they are a direct imagery, direct representation of this thing, unless it's a thing? Why do multiple different people speak of the devil? Why is that such a flippant term? Unless at some point in time somebody experienced a being that was devilish, evil-ish.
It could be, but I mean, there's so many different philosophies and worldviews and
Yeah.
religions that all infect, they become cultural memes.
Yeah.
And so for me, it's like I hear things like that. Um, someone who says the devil told me to do it, and I hear mental illness. I
Mm,
hear someone who has those voices that you and I have, but perhaps we can filter it. Like for me, it's intuition. For you, it's God. For him, it's the devil. And I think all of these various things, and I think it really comes down to your conditioning and the
mhm.
perspective that you view. Whether it's right or wrong, frankly, I don't really think matters. There's a compelling argument for. I was talking with this, on a previous podcast with John Hears, and he's a religious man. He runs a nonprofit, does a lot of good in the world, and one of the things that I share with him is that I think, and I think this kind of surprised him, was like I think that as society is becoming more secular, there's aspects that are negative to losing the religious aspect. And I'm someone who's I don't really. I'd say I'm probably agnostic.
Mhm.
I veer towards like we don't know. It doesn't really knowing or unknowing doesn't really impact my life at all personally. So I just veer towards like there's no data. So it is what it is.
Right.
I'm just saying I don't know. And and but as someone, for me, I see like people that go to church and the community that they have and the positive aspect of I don't know. The group mentality, like the
Yep.
positive aspect of that, where it connects people and it's a positive tribe. There's the negative aspect of tribalism, which is what I think you saw at the people that were at Billie Eilish that were being very tribal and judging, and it's like that's not productive. If you if you the whole concept that my understanding of Jesus was looking at these individuals as like they just don't know, having empathy and love and trying to share that with people, not yelling at them and condemning them. Because again, like almost all of us, if we all grew up in the time and the place and had all of the context that you did, you come to the same conclusion, you know, that person, it's like to me, it's like that is causality. That's why personally I don't really believe in free will, capital F, capital W, free will, because it's just like we are so much like for example you talk about the generational trauma. It's like you are a product of your parents are a product of your grandparents. You grew up in a time and place, you were raised in a certain way. Did you ask for any of that? Were you did you will any of that? So it's like you don't really have full agency because so much of the genetics and what you're born into and all this early childhood conditioning creates who you are, which then dictates the rest of your fucking life. So it's like you don't fully have free will because so much of your life is dictated for you. And you have to spend so much of your life reverse engineering like all these coping mechanisms and things, and it's just it's a lot. So I don't know. That's where like I try to really understand where people are coming from, whether it be someone who's a Christian, someone who's a Muslim, someone who's Jewish, someone who's a Scientologist. I mean, to me, you look at Scientology and it's just like you kind of have direct evidence that this was literally made up in the last like 60 years, but it does something for people. Um, and so I think that there is a lot of benefits to, regardless of the flavor of religion and whether it's factual or not. I think that there's a lot of benefit for people to feel like they have a knowing
Yep.
and there's a comfort there. So like I feel like there's kind of two sides of this whole equation. One is like, is it actually true? But the other one is like, is it true for you? Is it benefiting your life? Um,
Yeah, because that's the same thing even in church. The thing is you would think that you're a part of this overarching tribe that believes God is real. But is he real for you?
yeah,
Because just because Big C church believe you're walking into a Southern Baptist church, a Presbyterian church, a Pentecostal church, and they say God is real. Do you believe it? Because you can walk into those doors every single time the doors are open and have the and never have the same experiences I've had because you don't believe it. So it's you could have overwhelming proof of anything in life. There's plenty of people who do this that have overwhelming proof that something is one way, and we talked about them earlier, where it's like I have this problem and it's unsolvable, and it's like no, you just do this one thing. No, that can't work. But you didn't even try. The only reason you didn't try is you don't believe it.
yeah,
So that's one of those things where it doesn't matter religion or religious or non-religious. Is it real to you? That's the biggest piece, even as you were saying.
yeah, yeah. What uh, what do you feel like is your North Star right now? Like as far as, because it's interesting, like when you think about the concept of like you could have a direction that you're going in your life, and that's something that you are sitting down and willfully directing. But then you have this other, let's just say, voice in your head that may come out of left field and completely throw a curveball. Um, how do you, I guess, navigate that kind of what could be conflict, you know?
Mhm.
Does do you feel like that other voice that always supersedes like your natural intuition, or have you ever denied it? And then
Yeah.
yeah, so how does that happen? How does that go?
So this is where I mean, we could go pretty much all day on this topic of free will and non-free will. Is I think that there is I'm gonna tread lightly for a second. Is I think that there's free will in moments, and so there's a moment where I'll have a voice, I'll hear a voice, and it'll say, "Quit the job." I could very easily be like, "Nah, I'm not doing that," and have
Yeah,
stayed. Now, would my life look the same? No. And does that mean that every single time I hear this voice, it supersedes everything I'm doing? No. Why? Because I am still me with all my emotions, and I could say that is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. I'm not doing it. And the one thing I've noticed, and again, this is just from my experiences, what I've encountered, is when I listen to the voice, may not make sense to me in the moment, but then 5, 10 years down the road, I look back and I'll say, "Oh, I'm glad I listened to that voice right then," because if I hadn't have, like, if I look back now, 3 years ago, and I was still working that job that I hated, if I hadn't have listened to that voice, I would not be here having this conversation with a great marriage. I would not be able to have a real relationship with my son had I not listened. And I think of that even with being in Oklahoma. So now we're getting a little smaller. Felt like we heard a voice that said, "Come to Oklahoma." And since coming here, we've had community for the first time in our lives, and community that actually cares, that who actually show up at our house. We actually had people over that were friends to our house for Christmas for the first time ever. We had never done that. Married almost 10 years. So when does it supersede is when I decide to listen. And how do I know the difference between that and intuition? Is there, for me, I think of the voice as seeing the bigger picture than what I'll see. So even in this is like for intuition, my intuition with the business space, because that's how we met, is my intuition was, well, I understand challenges. Challenges is the thing. Challenges is what I have a base knowledge on and an understanding of. This must be the thing. But then it took somebody from the outside to say that made no sense. Let me help you. And so my intuition in the moment was like, I'm about to tell this guy off. He doesn't know me. He doesn't know my story. He doesn't know what I've been through.
A
This is what I
little
told
a
Armand.
little context, you were doing marketing challenges. One
Yeah.
of the business that you were doing was, how would you describe a marketing challenge now? Uh, like what you were specifically doing at that time. Like, how, if you had to describe that in like a sentence, what would it be?
Ooh, that's a great question. Let's see.
Kind of case in point, I guess, or
Yeah.
where, yeah, like
So it's kind of like a virtual seminar, but not. It's
yeah.
different.
So yeah, essentially you were putting on like these seminars for people, but you were saying it was challenges. And then
Yeah.
when we got connected, I was like, what the fuck is a challenge? And then that caused this whole kind of uh, side conversation where we were just like, okay, well, what is it exactly to do? Who do you do it for? And how do you communicate that really simply? Um, so yeah, so like you had that that intuition on that.
hmm I had that
Yeah.
intuition that my way was the right way. I had already gotten close to it, so I had built that belief system that, oh, this is right. It's like it may not be doing exactly what I wanted to, but if I keep going at this current trajectory, at least I know that it will do something.
Yeah.
And then it took somebody seeing my situation from the outside to come in and interrupt my line of thinking and say, because you didn't like bombard me. You didn't tell me I was an idiot. You just said, let's work on this. Okay. Explain what do you do? Okay. Who do you help? How do you help them? And then going through that process, you were able to say, and it was really just an easy language flip. I didn't have to change anything about the deliverables.
Yeah.
All I had to change was what I was saying. And that one piece had immediate effect on the rest of my life. And that, honestly, every single conversation I've had since then, when they ask, what do you do? I'm able to say, we're done for you virtual event services. And then then they may ask, well, what does that look like? And I can go deeper instead of trying to explain what's a challenge, because they
Sure.
don't, when I'm trying to explain what a challenge is, they are trying to understand what is he saying, not what is his business. And that flip of done for you virtual events, most people know what a virtual event is. Most people can correlate, especially if they're in the digital space, what that looks like. And that's been one of those big shifts. So that's, again, I think of that voice as outside of myself. I have this intuition that this is the right way. Then this voice, this guiding voice will speak in from the outside and say, hey, do this. And I'll say, that makes no sense. Why would I do that? When I have full understanding and capability to keep pressing forward in this thing, why would I do that? And the voice will just say, do that. And so I'll do this. And then all of a sudden, everything else just works a little better. The same way it did with you. It's like, oh, shoot, that this actually works better because I listened. Because I could
Yeah.
have very easily taken your advice and just been, yeah, thank you so much. It was so good. And then done nothing with it. And
Some
absolutely
people
just,
do that. Yeah.
absolutely. I could have stayed the same course. You could have easily been trying to tell me, like, I'm the Titanic, watch out for that iceberg. And I could have said, I don't see that iceberg, man. I'll miss it. I don't need
Don't
you.
look
I
up.
see it. Yeah, it's like I'm good. But I the same way that I leaned into this guiding voice, I'm very open to, and this is what we talked about that first conversation. I'm open to all people, all face, all non-face, everything, because everyone, you can learn from everyone. But if you hold everything so tight gripped, you can never actually experience life for what it's supposed to be. And that was because if I would have done that with you, I would have missed one of the greatest gifts I was given in business. And that is one of those things I also, when I correlate it to a guiding voice, is in that moment, you were a guiding voice for me. And then when I look at the guiding voice that's guided the rest of my life, it's worked out well for me to take my intuition and just say, okay, this voice is telling me to do that. Obviously, in the past, I have built this belief system that in the past, my intuition will say one thing, but when I listen to this thing, it's worked out better. So why would I just keep down the same path? And there's definitely days that I just like, no, I'm not doing that. I'm not just going to go give money randomly to somebody. I'm just going to stay the course, do my own thing. And it's like, what have I missed?
Yeah. And that's the thing, is like it works for you.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that like I think about a lot when it comes to theology, religion, all these things, where it's just like, if it wasn't working for you, then I think that's why a lot of people have a lapse of faith. It just stops working for them. So it's like I always think about this, because it's just like I think it's different when you're talking about people that are extremist and they try to oppose their dogmatic views on others. I mean, that's a huge issue in the Middle East as a whole, like, and
hmm
also cults here. Like I talked with Amanda Gatarzi, she grew up in a cult, and she went through sex trafficking and all this stuff, and it's just like, yeah, it was a heavy conversation, but hearing like how she grew up in this, super alt-right, very extreme Christian cult here in the United States, where like they live this whole separate life, like that has massive effects, but as far as like outside of that, it's like it's working for you. So like again, it goes back to like again, like, is it working for you, and is it actually real? And I'm not trying to say that to minimize it, but it's just
Of
like one
course.
of those things where, like, let's say, for example, you knew definitively it was not real, right? In this hypothetical, you just knew, but it helped you with your life, and it actually guided you in a positive direction. Would you choose to continue with that, with knowing that it's not real, but it's still helping you, versus not having that, but having a worse life? And I think that's where the current kind of, secular divide that's happening is really interesting, that I don't really feel a lot of people talking about, because they just talk about like, I'm right, you're wrong, but they're not talking about like, I think that there's some serious downsides to being an atheist as far as like your mental health. It's there's a bleakness to it, and there's kind of I feel like there's probably a lot of people that probably kill themselves because they feel like there's no point to it. And I say that as someone who has wrestled with suicide, who has wrestled with the existential void and stuff. If you know that, like, hey, there's a God, and at the very least, like, there's a reason for why you're here, like, that takes a lot of fucking anxiety off your plate. So the
Hmm.
question kind of becomes like, as long as you're not being dogmatic about it and trying to impose your views on people, is it really hurting anything? And I go back and forth on that a lot. So
I, I would love to pose to you something in the scientific field, which is the placebo effect.
yeah.
We've all heard of the placebo effect, or and if you haven't, it's basically there's been multiple studies. You can look this up, where there'll be a group A, a group B, and there will be a medication. And they'll give the medication to one group and they'll give a placebo, which just means there's nothing in there but water, to another group, and they'll see what kind of effects they have. And it's been astounding that there's been times the placebo has gotten better effects than the medication. There's
Oh,
nothing.
routinely. Yeah,
Yeah.
there's a book that I'm getting treatment for autoimmune disease with the Cleveland Clinic right now, and there's a book that my doctor at the Cleveland Clinic recommended called "You Are the Placebo." It's by Joe Dispenza, and it is fucking nuts. Where like it sounds crazy, but there's all of these studies that he cites time and time again of not only what you're saying, but it actually are people that have had like spinal cord injuries. They're never supposed to
Wow.
walk again. And like through the placebo effect, like actually being able to walk again. I mean, crazy shit that seems like it should not happen. And
Mm.
and so there's just I feel like over the next 50 years, that is going to be a huge part of our toolkit, is understanding that there's all this possibility that you can unlock literally just with your thoughts. And it sounds like some pseudoscience nonsense, but again, it goes back to like us having a very limited understanding of our biology and like how we work, which I think also goes in line with what you're saying. Like, there's all these other things that we don't really understand yet, and we might. So, um,
And with
but
the
you said,
placebo effect, was where I was going with that is just that the belief that something is going to help you is what helps them. It's
yeah,
not it's actually that medication is helping them. There most of the time, it's just a capsule with water in it. There's nothing in it. But yet they believe so strongly that what's being given to them is going to heal them, is going to help them, that it helps them. So the same thing can be correlated with faith as well. I knew today that my faith was completely a farce. I would still take the placebo just
mhm,
because I believe it. It helps me. So even if at the end of my days, if I close my eyes and there's nothing out there, I just go back to dust, I will have lived my life believing that having faith helps me, and it will in turn help me. Because but why, Stephen, why would it help you? Because I believe it. I believe that it will. And that's why I sit there and I think of, if we're sitting there talking about the placebo effect, is people want that one shot of 100% this is going to work, but oftentimes it doesn't, because they don't believe that it will. But if you have something and you just believe that it's going to help you, in turn, most of the time it helps you. Like even with the book you're reading, there's stuff that should not work. Like these spinal cord injuries should not get healed, but somehow them just believing in something that there's nothing in is healing them. So could that definitely could obviously just be the mind. Like there's more about our mind that we don't understand. Like our
For sure.
mind is wildly powerful. So just believing in something that actually has no physical properties to help us helps us. That's wild to me.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, that's one of the reasons I have my autoimmune condition. It's it all has to do with your brain basically having these defense mechanisms, which then triggers your immune system, and then it causes this whole cycle. And it's literally conscious and subconscious, and it's nuts. But one of the things that comes to mind is like what you're saying is that your belief is a compelling story, and it's a
Mm,
story that helps you. And that is the one thing that I feel like is kind of lacked in a strictly scientific, kind of atheistic worldview, is that it's not a compelling story. Um, in the essence that, yeah, it's a story that, from our understanding is factually true, but it's very cold and it's very desolate. And it doesn't really, it, it, it's a very Spock-like kind of existence where you're just like, okay, all this is true, but what? Like I always think of like 2001: A Space Odyssey. Like, you've ever
mhm.
watched that,
Yeah.
Kubrick? At the end of the movie, you go through this whole journey and you see the Star Child, and you're like, okay, let's just assume that this is all real. You know, aliens had basically helped speed up our evolution, and then we are now this, the Ubermensch. We are now the next evolutionary step. You just kind of most of the people I've talked to that watch that movie, at the end of it, there's just this kind of existential questioning, like this existential, like, okay, that's there's a coldness to it. And again, it's back to like the void, you know? And so like I feel like there's that thing where it's like, let's just assume, and I think about this thought process so much, let's just assume that no religions are real. Literally, it is like you have a machine, you're alive, the plug is pulled, you're offline, you're done. It just cuts to black. It's like the end of Sopranos. Like it's just, it cuts to black, and that's, you stopped, and if you think about it, though, it's like, what difference does it actually make? Well, if the net benefit of it is positive while you're alive, I think about that all the time. Like, like, let's say you have a loved one or something who has like dementia or something like that, and you're sitting there and you're trying to make them have a good last couple, year, or you're trying to make their, the ease of them into, the to kind of going off to the next stage. You're trying to have them die peacefully. It's like, do they really need to know all the clinical procedures and all the sterile stuff that's happening? It's like, does that actually help them, you know, die better? I always think about that at the end of a movie where like the characters die. It's like, did I get him? It's like, you got him. You saved the day, even though you didn't get him, but you're telling that person so that in those last couple seconds, they can just die feeling like they helped. They made a difference. I think about that on a larger extent as like, that is, I think, like the big existential question for like, as we go towards like society being increasingly secular, is like, are we losing something in transition there? Like even if it is true, even if it is true that none of this is real, are we losing something? And how do you bridge that gap? Because again, it goes back to storytelling. Like, we are creatures that are led by stories. Everything about us is storytelling, and like the story for not believing in a story isn't very compelling. So like, it's just, I don't know. I guess this kind of goes to the next, probably my last question here is like, are you optimistic about the future?
Yes, 100%. And
Yeah,
the reason why is if we look over the last hour and some change talking about my belief system
yeah,
is even because I've definitely had those thoughts. I've had those thoughts even recently. It's like, what if I'm wrong? Like, what
yeah,
if my belief is wrong? But then I just think I would rather go all in on something that tells me that because if I'm the highest form of evolution, I'm the highest form of existence, that sucks because I don't feel like dogs can over here sense natural disasters before we can. There's been multiple stories of dogs saving humans. We're not the top of the food chain if we're just stuck out in the wild. Bears can kill us much easier. If you're in the ocean, sharks can eat us much easier. We can eat sharks. So if we're the top of the food chain and there's nothing bigger than us, then as you said, it's like a bleak existence. So if I can sit there and just put and go all in that there is something higher that has pieced my cells together and just believe in it enough to sit there and think that this is helping me walk through life, because even on a micro level is as I'm believing that this higher creator exists, it also lets me know that I'm not alone. And we hear that talked about with the extraterrestrials is, but for me, it's even when I feel alone, I'm not alone. So it empowers me to keep moving even in my darkest moments, because I would rather go all in with something that's helping me. And at the end of my day, be like, oh, I was wrong, but at least it helped, than to go all in on something that doesn't help me my whole life and then get to the end and realize, oh, shoot, God exists. Like by then it's too late. So I'd rather go, like, I would rather be wrong, but live a good life.
I'm curious, like, what is like this could end up open up a whole can of worms, but I'm just kind of curious, like, if you got to the end of your life and then, like, you're dying, and then you just you have that kind of cliche, like everything goes to white, and then you've got that kind of almost like bureaucratic moment where it's just like, all right, well, you're dead. Here's how the next stage is going to go. Also, yeah, it turns out Scientology is actually real. You picked the wrong faith. Just some random shit like that. Like, I guess it just kind of comes down to, like, would you have regretted anything?
No,
Yeah.
just the reason why is because of my belief system and where I put my belief in is it allows me to not only have a better life, but to impact more people. Because I believe there's a higher creator that loves me enough, that takes care of me, that lays me along the way, it helps me go out and love on people. Doesn't matter if they believe the same thing or not. There's more than one opportunity for me to just show love to someone else. Because for me, I'm optimistic for the future, but there's people who had all their money in Silicon Valley Bank that maybe they're not as optimistic about the future right now. But if I can go speak to them and say, hey, it's going to be okay. Do you at least have one person to confide in? I'm here for you, whatever it is. That if even if I got to the end and it's almost like Grand Theft Auto, I think it's Grand Theft Auto 5, where you get to like see a sum of all of your decisions and all your picks, and it's like,
Yeah.
this is why you
Yeah.
got this ending. Is if I get to the end and I pick the one where they kick off one of the three characters and he dies at the end, spoiler alert, is that for a 10-year-old game. But but if I get to the end and I'm like, oh shoot, I made the wrong choice. I just killed off one of the main characters. Then I'll at least say, but I did the best I knew.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, no matter how much you know, you'll never know everything. And so I will take my belief system that allows me to help myself and others, and I will use that to the highest degree I can to help myself and others along the way, whether through belief in God or not. For me, if I just, as I said, if I can just have empathy for how you feel, love on you in this space, especially today, it feels like love is a thing and empathy is a thing that's missed. And that goes for every place you go to. There's plenty of churches I went to, they don't feel for you, period.
Yeah.
They don't care about how you feel. They only care about getting that money. That's just real. And I hate to burst that bubble for some people. Not every church you walk into is just gonna love on you. But when you
Hell
find
no.
those churches that do, like I'm at one that does, which is great. This is the only one I've ever been to my whole life, and I grew up in church that actually loves on you no matter how you look. Like there's LGBTQ plus community that comes to our church. Why do we let them in? Because if there is a God, he would love them too. If there is a higher creator, he created them too. Just because he created them, then they believe different things. Why are you better than them? You're the same creator. That would make you the
Yeah.
same creation. So I just want to live my life with my little belief system, go love on people differently. So even if they go out and make different decisions, different choices, believe different things, maybe they can go impact somebody for the better. And that way the world gets better as a whole. That's why we're seeing more school shootings than ever, is because these kids don't feel seen, they don't feel heard, don't feel loved. So if I can just find somebody that doesn't feel seen, doesn't feel heard, doesn't feel loved, and give that to them, you never know. You might be saving a whole school full of kids. just by
Yeah.
loving somebody different. And that doesn't mean that you have to believe in God or not. You don't have to be religious to be able to do that. That just makes you a good person.
Yeah, I think it's just being a empathetic person that is not completely doesn't have main character syndrome where they're just constantly just distracted, and it's so hard in our like late stage capitalist society where it's just like the all the incentive is just to be selfish. It's just to think about the end result. It's not really to think about other people, and that is one of the things about people like you that are willing to donate their time and their effort towards helping other people. We didn't even get into your volunteer work, which maybe we do that in a round two. But is there anything we didn't touch on that you want to talk about before we wrap up?
No, I think that, well, two things is one, this is the longest podcast I've ever been on. So there's that, which is really
we're,
cool.
we're at or almost at 4 hours. So yeah,
Which
it's
is,
been a
yeah.
lot.
So we've recorded a short movie. But
Yeah.
the second thing is I just want to thank you for the space. Thank you for and this is just who I am. You don't have the same belief system as me. That doesn't mean that I'm about to just hang up on this dude. I'm thankful that we were able to have a conversation, a genuine conversation about, hey, this is what I believe. Why do you believe that? You're
Yeah.
just asking a question the same way is you're curious.
Yeah.
That's just the way that for the people listening, if you're in business, that's how you stay in business. You just stay curious. And that's the same thing. So yes, just thank you for the space. Thank you for the authenticity. Thank you for you sharing the things that hurt you, the things that you've walked through, because it gave me the freedom to be able to do the same. And I've shared plenty on this podcast that I've never shared anywhere else. And I've been on over 30 podcasts. You're the one place, the one space that gave me freedom to do so. So thank you.
Thank you, man, for being willing to walk down that path with me. It's I that's the thing is like I see all these fucking podcasters and YouTube people and whatever, and they're all doing this gotcha bullshit. They're all just doing it for clips, well clicks, but they're trying to clip everything. Sam Harris just talked about this on a podcast with Lex Friedman. He's like, all these people are taking all these clips out of what I said out of context and then going to their audience and then basically framing a narrative, and their audience is never going to listen to the full interview. So they get to basically inject whatever they want to it. And the funny thing is, he's like, I know they're going to do it with this podcast. And they did. Like literally the next day, they took a bunch of stuff from his critiquing them doing it. And it's just like, I know that's going to happen to me. I know it's going to happen. And I don't give a shit. I'm thankful that people like you are willing to come on here and just be real. And I hope that I continue to uh, make you and other people feel like you're comfortable doing that, because that's the kind of shit that I want to put out into the world. There's too much like fucking people that are hateful and they just want to hear themselves talk and they don't actually want to try and understand other people. And I think that's
Hmm.
one of the things that I really clicked with you right away was like you were super open minded and curious, and you were open to that. And that's why to you were able to capitalize on the shit that we talked to together. I mean, that was you. It wasn't me. I was just being a mirror. But you took that and you ran with it, and I respect the hell out of that. So speaking of which, you do just kind of tell everyone real quick, how they can reach you and how they can work with you, and then we'll put all that stuff in the show notes as well.
Yeah. So for anyone who is curious, you can go to stephenpemberton.com. I actually finished that website. So
Oh
they
yeah,
can, yeah, I know, right? So you can go there, you can find everything about me, everything about the business all in one spot. And then if you're a social media kind of person, my social medias are on there too. But if you go to Instagram or Facebook, look for Stephen Pemberton. Look for the guy who kind of looks like Jason Momoa or Aquaman, and his name is Stephen Pemberton. That's probably me. If it's not, please screenshot that, find me, and then send it to me because that would be incredible. But yeah, again, I just wanted to thank you for the space. One thing that came to mind as you were talking about it with the clipping, especially, there's somebody can find this and easily clip this and make it seem like I just talked about how God isn't real. And you said, I remember seeing this picture when I was younger, where it's one singular picture, but one half of it shows a guard with a gun to the back of the head of a prisoner, and then
yeah.
it shows there's another side of the picture where it shows a soldier giving water to this prisoner. And depending on what side of the picture you see is what you believe to be true. So this is what they say the media does. Because one media outlet could show you the soldier giving water to this person and say, "Oh wow, that's amazing. They're out there reaching people and they're helping reform the nations." And then you see the other one where it's just a gun to the back of the head of this person and you go, "Oh my gosh." they're about to execute this person for no reason or whatever it may be. They help you draw conclusions based on what side of the picture you see. But when you see the whole picture is when you realize this is a prisoner that they're giving water to. So you can draw real factual conclusions. But so often I see that people build facts off of limited data sets. And and I'm just thankful that you gave the space to just put it all out there. It's like, hey, if they built, people believe a limited data set without listening to the whole thing. It's like, hey, you missing out on 99% of the content. That's on you.
You are. And that's the kind of, I mean, that's really, I guess if I have a mission with all this, like I said earlier, it's about, helping people be more empathetic. But really, I think it's like, there is no free lunch in any of this, and there is no like easy answers. Like the reality is that we don't actually know anything really with how the world works, because
Mm-mm.
so much of it is obscured by misinformation and propaganda, even on small ways. So like I guess what I'm trying to do is just make people kind of see the bullshit for what it is, and be okay with not exactly picking a side. Like, getting at, I mean, you could pick a side, but get outside of this tribalistic nonsense where like
Yep.
everyone's just fighting with each other and just being like, okay, let's take a step back. Let's analyze things. Let's try and work together and come to some sort of conclusion that's in everybody's best interest. But yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of money to be made for doing the opposite, which
Mhm.
is kind of how we find ourselves here. But anyway, man, let's do a round two down the road. Thank you
Sounds
so
good.
much, and thanks for doing this with me.
Yes, sir.
And that is it for this episode. Let me know what you thought in the comments, and if you enjoyed this, it would mean the world to me if you could give us a quick like on this video and subscribe to the channel. I know everybody asked for this, but that really is the best way you can kind of help us out. We'll be able to grow the channel, put more resources into this, and get some of the dream guests that I really want to have on for you guys. Also, if you use podcast apps, be sure to look up The Josh Boone Show on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or wherever the hell you listen to podcasts, and we show up on your feed there too. So, until next time, peace, y'all.